She is a liar. She always has been. My father told my fiancé just 20 days before our wedding. She has a secret child, my mother leaned in and whispered. Do not let her fool you too. I did not make a scene. I just stood in the shadows of the luxury catering hall and watched. I waited for my fiancé to panic, to demand answers, or to walk away. Instead, he simply stood up, pulled out his phone, opened a photo, and asked a single question that drained all the color from my parents' faces. Is this the child you are talking about? I am Blair, 29 years old. As a corporate forensic accountant, I make my living hunting down discrepancies and exposing hidden truths. But the biggest secret I ever kept was designed to protect the boy I love more than life itself. Before I take you through the night that changed everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family to protect your own peace. The ambush happened exactly 20 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Gavin and I were at the Grand Atrium, a sprawling glass building bathed in afternoon sunlight, finalizing our wedding menu. Gavin is a 32-year-old pediatric physical therapist. He is the most grounded, warm, and steady person I have ever known. We had spent the last 2 hours tasting truffle risotto and seared scallops, laughing over which dessert our guests would prefer. I excused myself to use the restroom, feeling a rare wave of pure, unadulterated happiness. I thought my parents, Donovan and Catherine, were finally behaving themselves. They had insisted on paying for the catering, a gesture I initially found suspiciously generous, but I had cautiously accepted. I should have known better. When I returned to the private dining suite, I stopped just outside the heavy oak doors. Through the slight opening, I saw my parents cornering Gavin. They had moved from their seats across the table and were standing over him, effectively trapping him against the velvet booth. My father, Donovan, had his hands planted firmly on the table, using his typical intimidation tactics. My mother, Catherine, stood right beside him, wearing her signature pearl necklace and a look of manufactured concern. I froze, holding my breath. I did not barge in. I did not yell. In my line of work, you learn more by watching people think they are unseen. I observed their body language, the rigid set of my father's shoulders, the tight, calculated pinch of my mother's mouth. They were closing in for a kill. She is hiding things from you, Gavin, my father said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, hushed tone. We tried to ignore it, tried to give her the benefit of the doubt, but we cannot let you ruin your life. You are a respected doctor. You come from a good family. We cannot let you walk blind into this disaster. My mother placed a manicured hand on Gavin's arm. Blair is a monster, Gavin. She whispered the lie with chilling sincerity. She had a bastard child when she was only 19 years old. She did not want the burden of being a mother, so she abandoned him. She threw him into the foster system and never looked back. She is cold, Gavin. She is completely devoid of empathy. Do not marry a woman who could throw away her own flesh and blood. The silence in the room was heavy. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. Most women would have burst into tears. Most women would have charged into the room screaming to defend their honor. But I am a forensic accountant. I deal with numbers, facts, and cold, hard data. I wanted to see how Gavin would handle this deliberate sabotage. I had trusted him with every piece of my complicated past, but facing my parents' toxic manipulation firsthand was a different test entirely. Gavin did not flinch. He did not gasp or pull his arm away from my mother. He slowly set down his linen napkin and looked at them both with an expression of profound calm. He reached into his suit jacket pocket and casually pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times, unlocking it, and navigated to his photo gallery. He found a specific picture and placed the phone flat on the table, pushing it toward my parents. Are you talking about Leo? Gavin asked, his voice completely void of the shock they were so desperately hoping for. I peeked through the gap in the door to see the screen. It was a photo we had taken just last month at a baseball game. Gavin was wearing a foam finger hat. I was laughing, and sitting between us with a face smeared in mustard and ketchup was 10-year-old Leo, the boy they had just called a bastard, the boy my mother claimed I had thrown away. My parents leaned in to look at the screen. The reaction was instantaneous and spectacular. Donovan staggered back a half step, the color completely draining from his usually flushed face. Catherine gasped audibly, her hand flying up to clutch her pearls. They stared at the smiling face of the boy they thought they had erased from existence. Their carefully constructed narrative was collapsing in real time. "Where did you get this?" my father demanded, his voice cracking with sudden panic. His authoritative posture crumbled, replaced by defensive aggression. "She brainwashed you. That is what she did. She spun you some sob story. You do not understand what that boy is. He is a stain on our family legacy. He is a mistake that should have remained buried." Gavin stood up, towering over my father. The warmth was entirely gone from his face. "That boy is my future stepson, Gavin," said his tone turning to absolute ice. "And if you ever refer to him as a mistake again, I will personally make sure you never see the inside of a hospital without needing a wheelchair." That was my cue. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the dining suite. The click of my heels echoed loudly against the hardwood floor. My parents whipped their heads around, looking like cornered animals. Catherine tried to speak, but her mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. Donovan glared at me, his fists clenching at his sides. "Are we finished here?" I asked pleasantly, walking over to Gavin and taking his arm. "You deceitful little brat," my father hissed, stepping toward me. "You think you have won. You think you can just parade that embarrassment around and we will sit quietly. We are paying for this wedding. We are paying for this venue." I smiled and pulled a black credit card from my purse. "Actually, Dad, you were paying for the catering, but I think I will cover the bill today." I turned to the head chef, who was standing awkwardly near the kitchen entrance holding a tray of untouched pastries. "Chef, these two guests are no longer welcome. Please have security escort them off the premises." My parents sputtered in outrage as the chef quickly signaled for the security guards. "You will regret this," Catherine shrieked, as a guard gently but firmly took her elbow. "You are ruining this family. We will not let you get away with this." I watched them being marched out of the elegant dining room, their protests echoing down the hallway. I took a deep breath and looked up at Gavin. He wrapped his arms around me, pressing a kiss to my forehead. The battle lines were drawn. The war had just begun, and they had no idea what kind of arsenal I had been building in the dark. The drive back to our apartment was charged with an electric heavy silence. Gavin kept one hand steady on the steering wheel and the other firmly wrapped around mine. The adrenaline from the catering hall was still humming through my veins, but my mind was already shifting into a cold, analytical gear. As a forensic accountant, I am trained to compartmentalize chaos. I do not react to emotional outbursts. I prepare for the retaliation. And the retaliation began the second we stepped through our front door. My phone, tossed carelessly onto the granite kitchen island, began to vibrate violently against the stone. It was a rapid, relentless assault of notifications. I walked over and illuminated the screen. Furious text messages from my parents were flooding in, stacked one after another in a desperate bid to regain control. Donovan was the first to threaten. "You have made a catastrophic miscalculation, Blair. You have until Friday to cancel this wedding, or there will be severe consequences." Catherine immediately followed her messages, dripping with the venom I had come to expect. "If you refuse to call off this sham of a wedding, we are going straight to the hospital board. We will tell Gavin's prominent medical colleagues exactly what kind of woman he is marrying. A degenerate who threw her own baby into the foster system so she could run off and live a selfish life. We will ruin his reputation, and we will ensure your firm fires you by Monday morning." Gavin stepped up behind me, resting his chin on my shoulder as he read the toxic threats illuminating the screen. He did not flinch. He did not ask me to explain or apologize. He simply reached around me, poured us both a glass of water, and pressed a reassuring kiss to my temple before walking toward the kitchen sink. His absolute lack of panic was the exact reason I was marrying him. I left the phone buzzing on the counter and walked down the hallway to my home office. The room was sparse, highly organized, and perfectly functional. I bypassed the sleek oak desk and knelt on the hardwood floor, pulling back a small rug to reveal the heavy steel floor safe embedded in the foundation. I punched in the sequence: 3824. The heavy locking mechanism clicked open with a satisfying metallic thud. I reached past the emergency cash envelopes and the property deeds, pulling out a massive black fireproof legal binder. It was heavily tabbed, meticulously indexed, and held the darkest, most carefully guarded chapter of my family's fraudulent history. I ran my hand over the cover, feeling the weight of the secrets inside. Through my years of auditing corrupt corporations, I learned early on that people will lie effortlessly, but paper trails and legal signatures always tell the exact truth. I flipped the heavy binder open to the first red tab. Resting inside a protective sleeve was the original hospital intake record from a highly discreet private medical clinic situated 3 counties away from our hometown. The date of admission was exactly 10 years ago. The patient name printed clearly at the top was Vanessa Williams. The age at the time of admission was 23. My perfect pageant-winning sister, the golden child who could do no wrong, the pristine socialite who was at that very moment 10 years ago being groomed by our parents to marry into a wealthy, influential family. I turned to the next tab, the state surrender documents. I stared at the faded blue ink on the bottom line. Vanessa's signature was right there, legally releasing all parental rights to a healthy newborn baby boy. And right beneath her signature, acting as official witnesses to the abandonment, were the signatures of Donovan and Catherine. They had forced their own daughter to surrender her newborn to the state just to protect her flawless image and preserve her lucrative marriage prospects. They had willingly thrown a helpless infant into the cold, unpredictable machinery of the foster care system simply because a child was a public relations liability to their desperate social climbing. I flipped to the third section of the binder. It contained printed copies of emails and holiday newsletters Catherine had sent out to our extended family a few months after the birth. I was 19 at the time, living in a cramped university dorm room across the country, burying myself in accounting textbooks to maintain my scholarship. My mother had used my physical absence as the perfect alibi. She began whispering to aunts, uncles, and family friends that I had dropped out of sight due to reckless, shameful behavior. She carefully planted the rumor that I was the one who had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, positioning me as the family disgrace while elevating Vanessa as the pure, untouchable standard of perfection. I became their ultimate scapegoat, the convenient villain in their manufactured narrative. My hands gripped the edges of the binder tightly as I looked at the final section. The adoption papers. The brutal, agonizing legal war I had waged 5 years later, the very second I had the financial firepower and legal representation to audit the state system, track down my biological nephew, and rescue him from the overcrowded group home where he had been discarded. Leo, the boy who now slept safely down the hall in his own room. A sudden violent pounding on our front door shattered the quiet of the apartment. I froze. Gavin's voice echoed from the living room asking who was there. The pounding intensified, frantic and desperate, accompanied by the muffled sound of a woman crying. I quickly shut the heavy binder, secured it back inside the steel safe, spun the dial and pulled the rug back into place. I walked out into the foyer just as Gavin unlocked and opened the front door. Vanessa pushed her way inside. She looked nothing like the composed, arrogant socialite she portrayed to the world. Her expensive designer trench coat was wrinkled, her perfect hair was completely disheveled, and dark streaks of mascara ran down her flushed, panicked cheeks. She was hyperventilating, entirely consumed by a terror I had never seen her display before. She spotted me standing in the hallway and immediately launched into a theatrical display of despair. Vanessa dropped her designer handbag directly onto the floor and stumbled forward, grabbing my arms with shaking hands. "Blair, you cannot do this to me," she gasped, her voice breaking into loud, dramatic sobs. "You have to hide him. You cannot bring that bastard to the wedding." I looked down at her manicured hands, gripping my sleeves, feeling nothing but cold disgust. "Terrence cannot know," Vanessa cried, her voice reaching a hysterical, frantic pitch. "He is a deputy district attorney. He comes from a prominent, respected African-American family of legal scholars. He is absolutely obsessed with honesty and moral integrity. If he finds out I had a child and gave him away, if he finds out my entire past is a lie, he will divorce me. He will ruin my life. You have to keep that boy locked away." She sank to her knees right there in our foyer, clinging to my clothes, weaponizing her tears just like our parents had taught her. She begged me to protect her lies entirely, unaware that I was no longer the naive 19-year-old girl they had used as a shield. I simply stared down at the sister who had let me take the fall for her sins, waiting for her pathetic performance to run its course. I did not reach out to help her up. Gavin remained silent at my side, his presence a solid wall of support, but he knew this was a battle I had to handle. The seconds ticked by, heavy and suffocating in the small entryway. Vanessa's dramatic sobs echoed off the walls, but when she realized no one was rushing to comfort her, the pitch of her crying began to shift. The hysterical gasps slowed. The trembling shoulders stilled. Like a switch being flipped in a dark room, the performance ended. Vanessa slowly stood up, brushing invisible dust off the knees of her $1,000 trench coat. The frantic, terrified woman vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating socialite I knew so well. She wiped the smeared mascara from under her eyes with the back of her hand, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. She had tried to play the victim, and when that failed, she defaulted to her true nature. "You really think you hold all the cards, Blair?" she sneered, her voice dropping its previous tremor. "You think playing savior to a discarded kid makes you a saint? But you are just petty. You are doing this to ruin me because you have always been jealous." I crossed my arms over my chest. "I am not doing anything to you, Vanessa. I am getting married and my son is attending my wedding. The fact that his mere existence threatens your entire life is your problem, not mine." Her eyes narrowed into tight slits. "You do not understand what is at stake here. Terrence is not like those country club boys Mom and Dad tried to set us up with. He is a deputy district attorney. He built his entire career prosecuting people who neglect their responsibilities. His moral compass is rigid. His family is deeply rooted in this community, respected, flawless. Do you know what he would do if he found out the truth?" She took a step closer, her voice hissing like a cornered snake. "If Terrence finds out I had a child and surrendered him to the state just to protect my debutante image, he would look at me with absolute disgust. He would divorce me before the sun goes down. I would lose the marriage, the lifestyle, the social standing. His family would absolutely obliterate my reputation. I will not let you take that away from me just so you can play happy family in front of your little doctor friends." I stared at her, marveling at the utter lack of remorse. 10 years had passed, and she still referred to her own biological child as a threat to her lifestyle rather than a human being. She felt no guilt for abandoning him, only terror at being caught. Vanessa reached down and picked up the designer handbag she had dramatically dropped moments earlier. She snapped open the gold clasp and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. She slapped it onto our entryway console table with a sharp smack. "Dad had his corporate lawyers draft this up an hour ago," she demanded, tapping her long acrylic nail against the heavy paper. "It is a non-disclosure agreement, a binding ironclad gag order." I looked down at the envelope but did not make a move to touch it. "What exactly are you demanding I sign, Vanessa?" She lifted her chin, exuding a false sense of authority. "The terms are simple. You are legally barred from ever disclosing that the boy shares a biological connection to the Williams family. You will present him strictly as an unrelated foster child you took pity on. You will never, under any circumstances, allow him to interact with Terrence or his parents. You sign this, you keep your mouth shut, and Mom and Dad will fully fund your entire wedding. They will pay for the botanical glass house, the elite catering, everything. You get your dream day, and I get to keep my life." The sheer audacity of the document was staggering. They were trying to buy my silence, trying to legally erase Leo's bloodline to protect a coward's lie. They wanted me to treat my son like a dirty, shameful secret. I stepped forward and picked up the envelope. I slid the thick stack of papers out my eyes, scanning the dense legal jargon. It was drafted with the ruthless precision of my father's legal team, filled with financial penalties and threat clauses designed to terrify anyone who dared to breach it. It reduced my brilliant, resilient 10-year-old boy to a liability, a toxic asset to be managed and hidden. Vanessa watched me read, a smug smile beginning to creep back onto her face. Just sign it, Blair. Take the money and let it go. It is the smart thing to do. As a forensic accountant, I have handled thousands of legal contracts. I respect the law, I respect binding agreements, and I respect the power of a signature. But looking at this document, I felt nothing but a deep, roaring fury. I looked up at Vanessa, holding her gaze with terrifying calm. Then I gripped the thick stack of papers with both hands and tore them straight down the middle. The sound of the heavy paper ripping was sharp and loud in the quiet apartment. Vanessa gasped, taking a step back, as if I had physically struck her. I stacked the torn halves together and ripped them again, destroying the signature lines, destroying the penalty clauses, destroying their pathetic attempt at control. I let the shredded pieces flutter from my hands, raining down onto the hardwood floor, right at her expensive leather boots. Leo is my legally adopted son. I stated, my voice echoing with absolute unwavering finality. He is not a secret. He is not a mistake. He is my family. He will be walking down the aisle at my wedding wearing a tailored suit, carrying our rings for everyone to see. I will never hide him in the shadows, so you can pretend to be a woman of high moral character. Vanessa stared at the shredded paper at her feet, her chest heaving as the reality of my refusal set in. The panic completely evaporated, replaced by a dark, volatile rage. Her face turned a mottled, furious red. "You are going to regret this," she snarled, her voice shaking with raw hatred. "You think you are so untouchable because you have your little financial job and your perfect fiancé. You think you can ruin my marriage and walk away unscathed." I stood my ground, refusing to flinch. "Get out of my home, Vanessa." She backed toward the door, her eyes blazing with a promise of absolute destruction. "You are going to pay for this, Blair. Mom and Dad are not going to hold back anymore. By the time I am finished with you, you will not have a career left. You will not have a wedding. I will burn your entire life to the ground before you ever make it to that altar." Vanessa turned on her heel, yanked the front door open, and stormed out into the hallway. She slammed the door behind her with such incredible force that the framed photographs on our entryway wall rattled against the plaster. The sudden silence in the apartment was deafening. I stood in the foyer, staring at the closed door, the torn pieces of the non-disclosure agreement scattered around my feet like fallen snow. Gavin stepped up quietly behind me, wrapping his strong arms around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin on my shoulder, his steady heartbeat a grounding rhythm against my own racing pulse. The threat was explicit. The deadline was set. My sister had just declared total war, and I knew my family had the financial and social resources to make good on her promise. They would come for my job. They would come for my reputation. They would try to strip away everything I had worked for. But as I looked down at the shredded contract, I felt no fear, only a cold, sharp anticipation for the battle ahead. 2 days passed with a deceptive, heavy quiet. The shredded pieces of the non-disclosure agreement had long been swept into the trash, but the echo of Vanessa's threat lingered in the apartment. I knew my family too well to believe their silence meant surrender. They were simply reloading. I just did not expect them to aim directly at my livelihood. It was Wednesday morning at the corporate accounting firm where I had spent the last 7 years building an impeccable reputation. I was deep into auditing a merger acquisition file when the sharp ring of my desk phone broke my concentration. It was the executive assistant to the firm's managing partner asking me to come to the Human Resources Director's office immediately. The protocol for such a summons was never casual. You do not get called into HR alongside the managing partner unless a catastrophic breach has occurred. I locked my workstation, smoothed the front of my blazer, and walked down the glass-walled corridor. I did not feel panic, but my senses were heightened. When I stepped into the spacious corner office, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Our HR director, a stern woman named Evelyn, sat rigid behind her desk. Next to her stood Marcus, the managing partner, looking deeply uncomfortable. Placed squarely in the center of the desk was a thick manila folder. "Blair, please take a seat," Marcus said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite them. He did not offer small talk. "We received a highly sensitive anonymous ethics complaint this morning regarding your professional conduct. It was flagged directly by a member of our executive advisory board." I sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "I am listening." Evelyn opened the folder, her eyes darting between the papers and my face. The tip alleges that for the past 5 years you have been systematically embezzling client funds through a series of shell accounts. The accusation claims you have been siphoning this money to secretly support an undisclosed out-of-wedlock child that you hid from your family and employers. The board member insisted we open an immediate full-scale investigation into your accounts and potentially suspend you without pay, pending federal notification. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My father had not just tried to get me fired, he had tried to frame me for a federal crime. Donovan had used his elite country club connections to bypass standard corporate protocol, feeding a poisonous career-destroying lie directly to a board member he golfed with. They wanted to strip away my income, ruin my professional license, and leave me destitute so I would have no choice but to crawl back and submit to their demands. I did not break eye contact with Evelyn. I did not raise my voice or offer a tearful denial. Instead, I leaned forward, my forensic instincts kicking into overdrive. May I see the name of the board member who forwarded this anonymous tip? Marcus frowned, hesitant to breach confidentiality, but the severity of the situation compelled him to turn the document toward me. There it was, Richard Sterling, a man who owned the locker right next to my father at the Oak Ridge Country Club. I need exactly 5 minutes, I told them, pulling my company-issued laptop from my tote bag and placing it on the edge of Evelyn's desk. As an auditor who investigates corporate fraud for a living, my own finances are kept with a level of precision that borders on obsessive. I bypassed the standard firm network and logged into my secure encrypted personal server. I turned the screen toward Marcus and Evelyn. Let us conduct this investigation right now. What you are looking at is a comprehensive 5-year digital footprint of every single dollar that has ever entered or exited my possession. You will see my salary deposits, my bonus structures, and my authorized, heavily taxed stock dividends. You will see exactly where every cent went down to my weekly grocery bills and utility payments. There are no shell accounts. There are no offshore transfers. There is absolutely zero overlap between my personal wealth and any client ledger. Marcus leaned in, his eyes scanning the impeccably organized spreadsheets. The data was irrefutable, but I was not finished. I opened a secondary encrypted file, pulling up a high-resolution scan of a state-certified legal document. As for the secret child this tipster claims I am hiding, I continued, my voice sharp and cutting. Here is the final adoption decree from the state family court. The boy in question is named Leo. He is my legally adopted son. He is not a secret, and he certainly is not funded by stolen money. I rescued him from the foster care system 5 years ago, fully supporting him through my own lawful income. The people who abandoned him to that system 10 years ago were my own family. And the man who planted this fake tip with Richard Sterling is my father, Donovan Williams. Evelyn gasped softly, looking from the adoption papers to my face. Marcus stood frozen, the realization of what had just occurred washing over him. I pulled up a final document, a social club registry listing Donovan and Richard as regular golf partners, effectively exposing the exact backdoor channel my father used to weaponize the firm against me. My father is currently trying to force me to sign a non-disclosure agreement to hide the true parentage of my son, I explained, closing the laptop with a decisive click. When I refused to comply 2 days ago, my sister promised to destroy my career before my wedding. This ethics complaint is not a professional warning. It is a family vendetta executing a malicious, coordinated attack on this firm's integrity. The silence in the HR office was absolute. Marcus ran a hand over his face, his initial discomfort morphing into a cold, protective fury. My boss was not angry at me. He was livid at my father. He realized that a prominent board member had been manipulated into acting as a hitman for a petty family dispute, compromising the firm's time and resources over a fabricated lie. Blair, Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave as he looked at the bogus file on the desk. You are not suspended. Your job is entirely secure. I will be having a very private, very intense conversation with Richard Sterling regarding how he evaluates his sources. We do not allow our ethics protocol to be used as a weapon for personal blackmail. Evelyn quickly gathered the papers, apologizing profusely for the distress the morning had caused. I accepted their apologies with professional grace, packed my laptop, and walked out of the office. Outwardly, I projected total victory. I had dismantled my father's corporate sabotage in less than 10 minutes. But internally, a heavy, chilling realization settled into my bones as I walked back to my desk. My parents were not just trying to force me to cancel a wedding or ruin a party, they were willing to send me to federal prison. They were willing to bankrupt me, revoke my accounting license, and leave a 10-year-old boy without a home, all to protect Vanessa's flawless facade. They had crossed a line from toxic manipulation into absolute destruction. The gloves were completely off, and I knew their next strike would be even more desperate. I had barely settled back into the rhythm of my workday when my cell phone vibrated across my pristine desk. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times, staring at the glowing screen, marveling at the sheer psychological endurance it must take to casually call your daughter mere hours after attempting to orchestrate her federal indictment. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Catherine did not even pause for a greeting. She launched into her dialogue with the brisk, self-important cadence of a woman organizing a charity luncheon, utterly ignoring the fact that her husband's attempt to ruin my career had just spectacularly imploded. "Blair, we need to discuss logistics," she announced, the clinking of a silver spoon against a china teacup echoing in the background. It was surreal. She was having afternoon tea. "There has been a change of plans regarding the wedding arrangements. Since you have made your rather stubborn position clear, we are going to pivot. I need you to forward the confirmation emails for the Astoria Botanical Glasshouse to Vanessa's event planner immediately." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, narrowing my eyes at the glass wall of my office. The Astoria Botanical Glasshouse was not just a venue, it was an architectural masterpiece. An expansive Victorian-style conservatory, constructed entirely of wrought iron and crystal-clear glass housing thousands of rare orchids and exotic flora. It had a sweeping view of the city skyline and a waiting list that spanned 5 years. Gavin and I had only managed to secure our date because of a miraculous last-minute cancellation, and we had paid the massive non-refundable deposit from our own joint savings. "Are you telling me to surrender my wedding venue?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level, treating her demand like a fascinating data anomaly. "Do not use that hostile tone with me," Catherine scolded. "I am trying to salvage a complicated situation. Terrence is preparing to officially announce his candidacy for senior district attorney. The press will be heavily scrutinizing their marriage, and Vanessa needs a high-profile event to elevate his campaign optics. We have decided that a grand 10-year anniversary vow renewal at the Glass House is the perfect political photo opportunity. It will project family unity and traditional values to his voter base." I processed the sheer insanity of her request. Vanessa had been married to Terrence for exactly 4 years, not 10. But in my mother's world, facts were entirely malleable if the aesthetics were right. They wanted to steal a highly coveted, fully paid venue out from under me to stage a fake anniversary party for a political campaign. "And where exactly does that leave my wedding?" I asked, humoring the delusion. Catherine released a long, dramatic sigh, the kind of sigh she reserved for dealing with unruly retail workers. "Be realistic, Blair. Your wedding is tainted anyway with that boy present. Hand over the deposit and we will forgive your insubordination. The society pages will have a field day with the scandal of an out-of-wedlock child roaming the reception. You can take your little doctor to the courthouse and have a quiet, private civil ceremony. Transfer the booking to your sister, and we will consider letting this whole ugly mess go. We might even attend the courthouse signing if our schedule permits." The demand was so magnificent in its arrogance, so entirely detached from reality, that I did not feel a trace of anger. I felt something else entirely: amusement. A genuine bubbling laugh escaped my chest. It started small and quickly grew into a full, resonant laugh that echoed in my quiet office. It was the laugh of a woman who had just realized her enemies were no longer fighting with strategy, but with blind, staggering greed. "Excuse me," Catherine snapped, her voice rising in pitch, entirely offended by my reaction. "What on earth is so funny?" "You are," I replied, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of my eye. You just tried to frame me for corporate embezzlement this morning, and now you are asking me to gift you a $50,000 botanical garden booking to boost a political campaign. You have absolutely lost your mind, Mother. Blair, you listen to me right now, she shrieked, the polished tea party facade shattering instantly. No, I said, my voice dropping back to the cold, clinical tone of an auditor closing a fraudulent account. I am not giving Vanessa my venue. I am not hiding my son. And I am certainly not asking for your forgiveness. You do not have the leverage you think you do. I pulled the phone away from my ear as she began to scream and pressed the red end call button, cutting her off mid-sentence. I did not waste a single second. I immediately pulled up my contact directory and dialed the direct line for Julian, the elite event coordinator at the Astoria Botanical Glasshouse. He answered on the second ring, his cheerful voice a stark contrast to my mother's venom. Julian, I need you to implement an immediate security protocol on my booking. I instructed, bypassing the pleasantries. My family is attempting to interfere with the event. I need you to place a strict password protection on my account. No cancellations, no menu changes, and absolutely no transfers of the deposit to another name or party without my physical presence and government-issued identification. Julian gasped softly, but as a veteran in the luxury wedding industry, he was no stranger to family sabotage. Of course, Blair. I am locking down the file right now. Anyone who calls regarding your date will be told the information is strictly confidential. What would you like the security password to be? I thought for a brief second about the weapon they were trying to use against me, the secret they were so desperate to bury. Leo, I said clearly into the receiver. The password is Leo. I thanked Julian and ended the call, setting my phone face down on the desk. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a profound, calculating clarity. My parents were no longer operating like tactical masterminds. They were flailing. The HR complaint was a brutal, aggressive strike, but demanding the venue for a fake vow renewal was pure, unadulterated desperation. Catherine and Donovan were realizing that their usual methods of control, financial intimidation, and social shame were completely ineffective against me. Vanessa was clearly spiraling, terrified that Terrence was getting closer to the truth, and her panic was driving them to make reckless, impulsive demands. They wanted the glass house because they needed to distract Terrence, to blind him with political ambition and beautiful optics so he would not look too closely at the timeline of his wife's past. They were running out of time and they were running out of options. I turned back to my computer screens, pulling up my financial spreadsheets with renewed focus. The venue was secured. My job was secure. My son was secure. Let them grow desperate. Let them claw at the walls of the trap they had built for themselves. I was going to let them exhaust every single resource they had before I finally laid the ultimate truth right at the feet of the one man they feared the most. Terrence was a prosecutor, and soon I was going to hand him the case of a lifetime. 14 days before my wedding, the battleground shifted from the sterile corporate corridors of my accounting firm to the glittering velvet-draped ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. It was the annual Justice and Equity Charity Gala, a highly publicized, exclusive event hosted by Terrence's prestigious family. His father was a retired appellate judge, his mother a prominent civil rights advocate, and Terrence himself was currently the golden boy of the local political scene, quietly laying the rigorous groundwork for his senior district attorney campaign. The room was a vast sea of bespoke tuxedos, silk evening gowns, and the subtle clinking sound of old money mingling with ruthless political ambition. Gavin and I had been invited months ago, long before the war with my family had escalated to its current vicious state. As Gavin guided me through the crowded ballroom, his hand resting reassuringly against the small of my back, I observed the intricate social dance happening around us. I knew my parents and Vanessa would be here. This was their arena. Catherine and Donovan thrived in these environments, wielding their country club status like a bludgeon, while Vanessa played the role of the perfect political wife with sickening ease. I expected a confrontation, but I underestimated their willingness to leverage Terrence's own parents to execute their next move. We were exchanging pleasantries near a towering ice sculpture in the center of the room when the encirclement began. They moved with the coordinated precision of a hunting pack. Donovan approached from the left, Catherine from the right, and Vanessa materialized directly in front of me, bringing Terrence's mother, an elegant, imposing woman named Eleanor, along with her. The trap was masterfully set. They had cornered me in the most public, high-stakes location possible, surrounded by the city's legal and political elite, knowing my professional instincts would prevent me from causing a loud, messy scene. Vanessa did not waste a single second. She bypassed the standard greetings and immediately launched into a performance worthy of a stage actress. She reached out and grasped Eleanor's arm, projecting a cloying, sorrowful warmth that made my skin crawl. Eleanor. I am just so relieved Blair decided to show up tonight. Vanessa sighed, her voice pitched at the exact volume required to carry over the ambient chatter to the surrounding guests. We have all been so terribly worried about her lately. You know how it is with families. You try so hard to guide the ones who stray, but eventually you just have to pray they find their way back to the light. Eleanor looked mildly uncomfortable but trapped by strict social decorum, nodding politely as Vanessa tightened her grip. It is just so difficult, Vanessa continued, shaking her head mournfully. Blair had such a troubled youth. We spent years trying to help her overcome her rebellious phases and her destructive choices. Mom and Dad have sacrificed so much to keep her afloat, but she has always insisted on pushing us away. We are just hoping that her upcoming quiet little courthouse marriage might finally settle her down. We forgive her for her distance, of course. We will always forgive her. We just want her to be healthy and stable. It was a masterclass in character assassination, masquerading as familial concern. In less than a minute, Vanessa had painted me as an unstable, ungrateful delinquent who required constant financial and emotional bailing out. She was planting the narrative that I was a volatile outcast, ensuring that if I ever tried to speak out against them, my words would be instantly dismissed as the ravings of a troubled, jealous younger sister. She was building an impenetrable social fortress around her lie, using Terrence's respected family as the mortar. Catherine stood beside her, dabbing the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief, playing the heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. I stood completely still, my expression an unreadable mask. Gavin's grip on my waist tightened, a silent offer to intervene, but I pressed my hand over his to keep him anchored. I would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I would not raise my voice, and I would not defend myself against a fabricated history. I simply stared at Vanessa, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocatingly awkward. The longer I said nothing, the more frantic her performance appeared. The heavy, aggressive tension radiating from our small circle finally caught the attention of the one person they were trying to distract. Terrence excused himself from a nearby group of city councilmen and stepped up beside his mother. He was an imposing figure, tall and sharp-eyed, with the practiced diplomatic smile of a seasoned prosecutor. He instantly registered the predatory stance of my family and the icy, unyielding barrier I had erected in response. Sensing the immediate need to de-escalate the situation before it embarrassed his mother further, Terrence smoothly intervened. "If you will excuse us," Terrence said, offering a charming, apologetic nod to my parents and Vanessa. "I actually need to borrow Blair for a moment to discuss a small administrative detail regarding the charity board." He did not wait for their permission. He smoothly stepped between Vanessa and me, gently placing a hand on my elbow and guiding me away from the ice sculpture, navigating us toward a quieter, shadowed alcove near the terrace doors. Once we were out of earshot, Terrence let out a heavy breath, dropping the political smile. He looked at me with genuine, albeit patronizing, concern. "Blair, I do not want to overstep." He began, keeping his tone measured and calm. "But I prosecute domestic disputes and family fractures for a living. I know what toxic tension looks like. I know you and Vanessa have a complicated history, and I know your parents can be overwhelming. But holding on to this anger is only going to poison your own future. You are getting married in 2 weeks. You are starting a new chapter. For your own peace of mind, you need to find a way to make peace with your past. Let go of whatever rebellious grudges you are holding against your sister. It is tearing your family apart. He thought he was being kind. He thought he was dispensing wise brotherly advice to a troubled woman who needed guidance. He had completely bought into the narrative my family had sold him. I looked up at Terence, staring dead into his eyes, stripping away every ounce of polite social veneer. The atmosphere around us seemed to drop 10 degrees. A good prosecutor relies on signed documents, Terence, not family gossip, I said, my voice dangerously low and razor sharp. I do not have a troubled past, and I am not holding a grudge. I am holding the evidence. Be careful whose testimony you trust. The people you think you are defending are currently committing perjury right in front of your face. Terence froze. The patronizing concern vanished from his features, instantly replaced by the sharp, calculating gaze of a district attorney who had just caught a discrepancy in a witness statement. His brow furrowed, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hysteria or bluff. He found nothing but cold, absolute certainty. I did not wait for him to formulate a response. I turned and walked back toward the glittering ballroom to find my fiancé, leaving the senior district attorney candidate standing alone in the shadows, visibly unsettled, the first tiny, insidious seed of doubt firmly planted in his mind. I walked away from Terence, the heavy silence of his realization trailing behind me like a physical weight in the glittering ballroom. I found Gavin near the exit, handed him my coat, and we left the suffocating opulence of the charity gala. I had fired the first warning shot, planting a seed of doubt in the mind of the one man my family feared most, but I knew my parents would not simply wait for the fallout. They were frantic now. Their carefully constructed narrative was in jeopardy, and their next move proved exactly how low they were willing to stoop to preserve it. Exactly 10 days before the wedding, the frantic desperation of my family escalated into blatant identity theft. I was sitting at my kitchen island, sipping my morning coffee and finalizing the seating chart when my laptop screen lit up with a dual notification. 2 automated emails arrived within seconds of each other, their subject lines identical in their clinical, bureaucratic brutality. Cancellation confirmation. I set my mug down, my brow furrowing, and opened the first email. It was from the executive chef of our chosen premium catering company, confirming that the tailored menu for 150 guests had been officially scrapped at my request. The second email was from the boutique floral studio, confirming the immediate termination of our contract, canceling all centerpieces, aisle arrangements, and my bridal bouquet. My heart dropped squarely into my stomach. I had not canceled anything. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed the catering manager's direct line. When he answered, his tone was brisk and entirely unsympathetic. He informed me that I had called less than an hour ago, sounding frantic and apologetic, claiming a sudden family medical emergency required an indefinite postponement of the event. I demanded to know how the cancellation was authorized without my security password, the one I had just set up with the venue coordinator. The caterer paused, confused, stating that the venue's internal security lock did not apply to independent vendor contracts. Furthermore, he noted the caller had verified my full social security number, my current billing address, and my mother's maiden name. A cold, nauseating dread washed over me, chilling the blood in my veins. Catherine. My mother had successfully impersonated me over the phone. She had weaponized the intimate, confidential details of my identity, the very data a mother is supposed to protect, to dismantle my wedding day piece by piece. She knew exactly how to mimic my cadence, my tone of voice, and she had the personal identification data to bypass standard security questions effortlessly. Her goal was glaringly obvious. Without food or flowers, 10 days out from a massive event, she was banking on the sheer logistical stress, forcing me to postpone the wedding entirely. If the wedding was delayed, the public spectacle of Leo's presence was neutralized, buying them the critical time they desperately needed to handle Terence and suppress the truth. For the first time since this brutal war began, my armor cracked. I dropped my phone onto the granite counter, the screen splintering against the hard stone, and braced my hands against the edge of the island. A suffocating wave of panic seized my chest. I had fought corporate sabotage. I had faced down social humiliation, But the logistical nightmare of finding elite catering and floral arrangements for a major event in less than 2 weeks in a major city was statistically impossible. The sheer vindictiveness of my own mother stealing my identity to ruin my day finally broke through my meticulously maintained defenses. My breathing hitched shallow and rapid as the walls of the apartment seemed to close in around me. Gavin walked into the kitchen, his tie loosened from a long overnight shift, instantly recognizing the signs of an impending breakdown. He saw the shattered phone screen, my white-knuckled grip on the counter, and the rapid rise and fall of my shoulders. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply looked past me, reading the open emails glowing on my laptop screen. His jaw tightened, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek, but his demeanor remained incredibly calm, exuding the steady, unshakable authority he wielded in the trauma ward. He stepped up behind me, placing his large, warm hands over mine, gently prying my rigid fingers away from the stone edge. He turned me around and pulled me firmly into his chest, letting me bury my face in his shirt. He held me there, an immovable pillar of strength, until my breathing leveled out, until the terror receded into a dull, manageable ache. Then Gavin stepped back, pulled out his own phone, and took absolute control. As a highly respected surgeon at one of the city's most affluent private hospitals, Gavin had spent years building an extensive network of elite high-net-worth individuals. He bypassed the standard fully booked wedding industry entirely. He made 3 phone calls. The first was to a billionaire hospital board member whose private estate chef ran an exclusive underground catering syndicate reserved solely for high society private events. Within 15 minutes, Gavin had secured a culinary team that surpassed our original caterers in both prestige and quality. He explicitly mandated a dual signature authentication protocol for the new contract. No changes, no cancellations, and absolutely no communication would be authorized without both Gavin and myself physically present, presenting our government-issued IDs. The second call was to a private botanical importer who regularly supplied the hospital's lavish charity galas, securing a complete, breathtaking floral package that would be delivered on the day of the wedding under armed courier. But it was Gavin's third action that truly cemented why he was the man I was marrying. The original caterers and florists had attached massive non-refundable cancellation penalties to the terminated contracts. The total amounted to nearly $30,000 in breach of contract fees. Gavin did not dispute the charges. He did not attempt to explain the fraudulent impersonation to the vendors. Instead, he printed the invoices, attached a brief, legally binding cover letter drafted by his own hospital attorneys, and placed them in a heavy, formal envelope. He billed the entire penalty directly to Donovan Williams. Gavin sent the invoice via certified signature, required mail straight to my father's corporate headquarters, addressed directly to the executive suite. He included a short, handwritten note stating that any further attempts to impersonate me or interfere with our vendors would result in immediate federal charges for identity theft and wire fraud. He drew a line in the sand made of concrete and steel. As Gavin sealed the envelope, he looked at me, his eyes dark and uncompromising. My parents thought that they could break my spirit by overwhelming my logistics and weaponizing my own identity against me. Instead, they had just awoken the fierce, protective wrath of my future husband, and they were about to realize that I was no longer fighting this war alone. The next 48 hours passed with a deceptive, heavy quiet. Gavin's certified letter had clearly landed on my father's desk, like a live grenade temporarily stalling their aggressive tactics. I spent those 2 days meticulously reconfirming every single detail with our newly secured ultra-exclusive vendors. My professional life was locked down, my wedding logistics were ironclad, and my mind was entirely clear. But my sister, true to her fundamentally narcissistic nature, could not tolerate being outmaneuvered. The financial and authoritative blow Gavin had delivered to our father must have ignited a frantic, venomous firestorm at the family estate, because by Thursday afternoon, my personal inbox chimed with a new incoming message from Vanessa. I illuminated the screen and opened the email. The subject line was completely blank, but the body of the message contained a singular vitriolic paragraph demanding immediate financial restitution. Attached was an utterly absurd, meticulously formatted invoice, billing me for exactly $15,000. I read through the line items, genuinely marveling at her delusion. She was demanding $10,000 for severe emotional distress, claiming my refusal to cooperate was causing her unbearable psychological trauma. The remaining $5,000 was billed for a ruined, bespoke anniversary dress. She claimed she had already commissioned the gown for her fabricated vow renewal at the Botanical Glass House, and because I had selfishly refused to surrender my venue, the non-refundable garment was now useless. She was essentially trying to fine me for not submitting to her extortion. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to claw back some semblance of power, an infantile tantrum translated into a bogus digital document. However, it was the second attachment that elevated her petty retaliation into a severe criminal offense. I double-clicked the second file, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted official-looking header of a medical document. It was a clinical psychiatric evaluation from a highly discreet private mental health facility, dated exactly 9 years ago when I was 19 years old. The exact same year, Vanessa had secretly carried, delivered, and abandoned Leo. I read the clinical notes, feeling a cold, dangerous calm settle over me. The document detailed a severe psychotic breakdown. It described paranoid delusions, pathological lying, and extreme emotional instability. It painted a picture of a deeply disturbed teenager who required heavy medication and institutional confinement. And right at the top of the patient file in crisp black typography was my name. Vanessa had actually paid someone to completely fabricate a medical record. She had commissioned a forgery to make it look like I was the one who had spiraled out of control during my college years. It was a brilliant, albeit highly illegal, piece of manipulation. She was constructing a convenient documented excuse for why I might suddenly, delusionally claim that an unrelated foster child was actually a blood relative of the Williams family. Her accompanying message laid out the blackmail with zero ambiguity. She promised to anonymously leak this forged psychiatric report directly to the state medical board and to the chief administrators at Gavin's hospital. She vowed to paint him as a compromised professional engaged to a deeply disturbed, volatile woman. She threatened to trigger a moral fitness review that could risk his medical license and destroy his pristine reputation. She gave me exactly 48 hours to wire the $15,000 and sign the original non-disclosure agreement to hide Leo, or she would press send. She expected me to crumble. She anticipated that I would call her in a blind panic, begging her to stop, terrified that my manufactured past would jeopardize my future husband's flawless career. She thought she had found the ultimate leverage. Instead, I did not even bother to type out a reply. I did not experience a single fraction of a second of fear. I felt a slow, dark smile spread across my face as my forensic accounting instincts took over. Vanessa, in her desperate, arrogant haste to break me, had just handed me written, time-stamped, digitally traceable proof of attempted extortion, blackmail, and the willful forgery of medical documents across interstate digital lines. I downloaded the extortion email, the laughable invoice, and the forged psychiatric evaluation. I opened my encrypted personal server, created a new, highly secure master directory, and named the folder Checkmate. I dragged the files inside, locking them away right next to the state-certified adoption papers, the hospital intake records bearing Vanessa's real name, and the digital footprint of my father's failed corporate sabotage at my firm. The trap was now fully, perfectly set, and my sister had just willingly walked right into the dead center of it, locking the door behind herself. I closed my laptop right at 5 o'clock, leaving the digital vault secured, and drove back to our apartment. The air inside our home was warm, filled with the rich, comforting scent of roasted garlic and simmering tomatoes. Gavin was in the kitchen, casually stirring a pot of pasta sauce, his tie discarded over the back of a chair. Leo sat at the granite island, his brow furrowed in intense concentration over a complicated math worksheet. I dropped my keys on the console and leaned against the doorframe, watching the two most important people in my world. I did not mention the extortion email. I did not bring up Vanessa, Catherine, or Donovan. The toxic, desperate machinery of my biological family had absolutely no place in the sanctuary we had built. I walked over and wrapped my arms around Leo from behind, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. He leaned back into my embrace with an easy, trusting smile, showing me a complex equation he had just solved. He was 10 years old, with eyes so observant and sharp, carrying a quiet resilience that mirrored my own. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out the small velvet ring box I had picked up during my lunch break, and set it gently right in the center of his math homework. Leo looked down, his eyes widening in surprise as he traced the smooth black fabric. I knelt beside his stool, making sure I was exactly at his eye level. I told him that in exactly 10 days he was going to put on a custom-tailored suit. I told him he was going to walk down a long, beautiful aisle surrounded by walls of glass and thousands of flowers. I told him he was going to carry the rings that would bind our family together forever. I looked deep into his eyes, ensuring he felt the absolute, unshakable truth of my words. I told him he was incredibly safe. I told him he was loved beyond any measure and that there was not a single force on this earth powerful enough to ever make me hide him. Gavin walked around the island and placed his hand firmly on Leo's shoulder, smiling down at the boy who was already his son in every way that truly mattered. The storm was cresting just outside our walls, but inside this apartment, we were an unbreakable fortress, and we were fully prepared to finish this war. Exactly 1 week remained before the wedding. The fortress of our apartment had served its purpose, shielding us from the immediate fallout of my family's desperate extortion attempts, but the real world eventually required our presence. There were tangible, undeniable preparations that could no longer be delayed. I took Leo to Arthur and Sons, a third-generation bespoke tailor, tucked away on a discreet tree-lined avenue in the city's historic district. It was a haven of quiet, masculine luxury, smelling richly of aged mahogany, pressed wool, and chalk dust. I had purposefully bypassed the bridal boutiques and standard rental shops, opting instead to purchase Leo a custom suit of his own. Arthur himself, a meticulous gray-haired man with a tape measure perpetually draped around his neck, was currently kneeling on the floor, adjusting the hem of Leo's navy tuxedo trousers with swift, precise movements. Leo stood on the circular velvet-covered pedestal, looking at his reflection in the antique trifold mirror. He stared at himself with a mixture of quiet awe and a blossoming, newfound dignity. I sat on a tufted leather Chesterfield sofa nearby, a glass of sparkling water resting in my hand, simply watching the 10-year-old boy transform. The tailored lines of the jacket gave him a posture that commanded respect, smoothing away the hunched defensive stance he had carried when he first arrived at my doorstep. He looked incredibly sharp, poised, and deeply loved. We were in a bubble of perfect quiet anticipation, entirely focused on the future. Then the heavy brass bell above the shop's frosted glass door chimed. It was a sharp, clear sound that shattered the tranquil atmosphere of the boutique. I did not immediately turn my head, keeping my focus entirely on Arthur as he pinned the left sleeve of Leo's jacket. However, the distinct grating pitch of my sister's voice instantly flooded the room. She was loudly complaining about the lack of available street parking, her designer heels clicking rapidly and aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. I slowly lowered my glass, my posture stiffening as I looked over my shoulder. Vanessa was sweeping into the shop, clutching a limited edition handbag like a shield against the world, projecting her usual aura of manufactured importance. Walking calmly a few steps behind her was Terrence. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal day suit, here to pick up his own tuxedo for the upcoming onslaught of political fundraising galas. The sheer statistical improbability of them walking into this specific exclusive boutique at this exact hour was staggering. But fate, it seemed, had a funny way of accelerating a carefully laid trap, deciding that my digital files were no longer sufficient. Terrence stopped dead in the center of the showroom. He was in mid-sentence, offering a diplomatic response to whatever mundane complaint Vanessa was airing, when his eyes casually swept across the room and landed on the fitting pedestal. The words died in his throat. He stopped speaking completely. The silence that suddenly fell over him was instantaneous, heavy, and absolute. As a senior district attorney, Terrence made a living observing the smallest, most easily overlooked details. He built his career on analyzing faces, detecting subtle lies in witness testimonies, and connecting disparate hidden pieces of evidence to form an undeniable objective truth. Right now, in the middle of a tailor shop, all of those razor-sharp investigative instincts were locking onto the 10-year-old boy standing in front of the mirror. I remained perfectly still on the leather sofa, watching Terrence's eyes narrow. His gaze began darting rapidly back and forth between Leo's profile and his wife. He was processing the visual data, his mind working at lightning speed. The resemblance was not merely a passing, vague family similarity. It was an uncanny genetic mirror that defied all logic or coincidence. Leo possessed Vanessa's exact almond-shaped hazel eyes. He had the identical sharp slope of her cheekbones. He carried the very same stubborn, distinctive set of the jaw. Even the specific way Leo tilted his head in the mirror as Arthur adjusted his collar was a flawless carbon copy of Vanessa's own nervous, unconscious tic. Terrence took a slow, deliberate step forward. His expression shifted from casual, polite interest to a profound, chilling confusion. I could practically see the gears turning behind his eyes. He was doing the math. He was calculating the years, subtracting 10 from his wife's current age, aligning the timeline of her supposed gap year in Europe with the age of the boy standing mere feet away. He was staring directly at a living, breathing ghost from his wife's heavily guarded, meticulously fabricated past. Vanessa, annoyed by his sudden, uncharacteristic silence, turned around to see what had captured his attention. Her eyes followed his intense line of sight. The absolute moment she saw Leo standing proudly on the pedestal, the color violently drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly ashen gray. Her perfectly applied, expensive makeup suddenly looked like a painted clown mask plastered over pure, unadulterated terror. She did not gasp in surprise. She did not freeze in shock. Vanessa went directly into a state of blind, hysterical panic. She lunged forward physically, throwing her entire body between Terrence and the trifold mirror, desperately trying to block his line of sight like a human shield. She grabbed Terrence's lapels, her hands shaking violently, her voice rising to a frantic, shrill shriek that echoed harshly off the mahogany walls and completely halted Arthur's tailoring. "She is stalking us!" Vanessa babbled, her words spilling out in a rapid, chaotic torrent. She pointed a trembling finger in my direction while keeping her body firmly planted in front of Leo. "Terrence, we need to leave right now. We have to go. Blair is obsessed with me. She followed us here to ruin your fitting. She is crazy, Terrence. She is trying to destroy our lives." Her hysteria was a jarring, messy spectacle, completely unhinged and utterly devoid of any rational logic. She was flailing wildly, desperately attempting to drag Terrence's sharp attention away from the glaring biological truth standing just a few feet away. She thought she could drown out his prosecutor's intuition with sheer deafening volume and ridiculous accusations. I did not say a single word. I did not stand up to defend myself against her wild claims of stalking. I simply crossed my legs, leaned back against the tufted leather, and watched her dig her own grave. The contrast between my icy, silent calm and her shrieking meltdown was the most damning piece of evidence in the room. Terrence did not look at me. He did not look at his frantic, spiraling wife. His jaw was set like granite. Gently, but with a terrifying, immovable force, he reached up and peeled Vanessa's desperate hands off his chest. He pushed her slightly aside, silencing her babbling without uttering a single syllable, just so he could maintain a clear, unobstructed view of the boy. The carefully constructed lies were dissolving in real time. The checkmate I had prepared was no longer just a digital file waiting on a secure server. It was standing right in front of them, in a custom-tailored suit, and the senior district attorney was finally looking at the evidence. The silence Terrence commanded was absolute. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell over the frantic, high-pitched shrieking of his wife. He simply stared at the boy on the pedestal, his chest rising and falling with a slow, measured rhythm that completely contrasted with Vanessa's hyperventilation. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant baritone that cut straight through the heavy air of the boutique, vibrating over the soft background hum of classical music playing from the tailor's vintage speakers. "Who is he?" Terence demanded. He did not ask what was going on. He did not ask why I was there. He asked the single precise question that ripped the foundation out from under Vanessa's feet. I stood up from the tufted leather sofa, smoothing the front of my blazer with deliberate, unhurried grace. I walked over to the pedestal, standing beside Arthur, who was still clutching his measuring tape in frozen, wide-eyed shock. I placed my hand firmly on Leo's shoulder. The boy looked up at me, his hazel eyes completely calm and fiercely intelligent. He had been prepped for moments like this. He knew he was safe. "Terence," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if we were discussing the weather rather than detonating a nuclear bomb in the middle of his marriage. "I do not believe you have had the pleasure of meeting my son. This is Leo. He is my legally adopted child." The word adopted hung in the air, echoing sharply off the polished mahogany walls and the glass display cases. I saw the exact second the syllable registered in Terence's brain. His sharp prosecutor eyes darted from my face to Leo's, and then with devastating slow motion to Vanessa's. He was looking at the genetic evidence. The identical almond-shaped eyes, the sharp sweeping slope of the cheekbones, the stubborn, distinctive set of the jawline. He was looking at a 10-year-old boy who bore absolutely no physical resemblance to me, but looked like a flawless carbon copy of the woman desperately clutching his lapels. Vanessa let out a strangled, breathless sound, something trapped between a sob and a gasp of sheer terror. She realized in that instant that her stalking narrative had completely disintegrated. Terence was not looking at a stalker. He was looking at a biological impossibility that suddenly made terrifying absolute sense. The missing gaps in her history, the sudden violent defensiveness of my parents, the frantic desperation to cancel my wedding venue. The pieces were snapping together in Terence's mind with the brutal, unyielding efficiency of a closing argument. "We are leaving!" Vanessa gasped, her fingers digging so harshly into Terence's forearm that her manicured nails practically pierced his suit jacket. "Terence, we have to go right now. I cannot be in the same room as her. She is sick. She is trying to ruin us. We are leaving." She began pulling him backward toward the frosted glass door, her expensive handbag bumping awkwardly against the display mannequins and knocking over a small stack of silk ties. She was completely abandoning the tuxedo fitting. She was abandoning any pretense of social grace or political decorum. She was a woman running for her life from a truth she could no longer suppress. Terence did not physically resist her pulling, but his compliance was entirely devoid of comfort or marital solidarity. He was not a protective husband escorting his distressed wife away from a perceived threat. He was a man allowing himself to be led out of a room because he needed immediate distance to process a massive reality-altering revelation. His body moved backward toward the exit, but his eyes remained rigidly locked on me. There was no confusion left in his gaze. The polite bewilderment had entirely vanished. In its place was a dark, highly suspicious, and intensely calculating glare. He looked at me, then down at Leo, and then back at me. It was the look of a man who had just realized he had been sleeping next to a stranger for 4 years. It was the look of a man who was mentally compiling a list of subpoenas, phone records, and background checks he was going to execute the moment he reached his office. He gave me one final long assessing stare before the brass bell chimed violently and the heavy door slammed shut behind them, cutting off Vanessa's hysterical babbling and leaving the boutique in a ringing, profound silence. Arthur exhaled a long, shaky breath, slowly rising from his knees and clutching his measuring tape to his chest. He looked at me, clearly unsure if he should apologize, pretend nothing had happened, or call the authorities. I ignored the empty space where my sister and her husband had just been standing. I turned my attention entirely back to the boy on the pedestal. I knelt down on the hardwood floor, bringing myself level with Leo, enveloped in the rich scent of chalk dust and premium wool. I reached up, gently adjusting the lapels of his custom navy jacket, smoothing a microscopic wrinkle near his shoulder to ensure the fit was immaculate. "You look incredibly handsome, Leo," I said, my voice warm and steady, completely devoid of the cold warfare that had just coursed through the room. "That jacket fits you perfectly. You are going to be the sharpest man in the room." Leo looked down at me, the corners of his mouth tipping upward in a small, confident smile. He had not flinched during Vanessa's screaming. He had not cowered under Terrence's intense, interrogating scrutiny. He was strong, shielded by the absolute certainty that Gavin and I would never let anyone harm him. "Thank you," he replied softly, turning back to admire his reflection in the antique mirror, adjusting his cuffs, just the way Arthur had shown him. "I really like the color." I stood up, signaling to Arthur with a polite nod that we were ready to finalize the alterations. As the tailor tentatively stepped back to the pedestal to finish pinning the hem, I walked back to the leather sofa and picked up my glass of sparkling water. I took a slow sip, letting the cool liquid soothe my throat. The encounter had been a total accident, a wild, unpredictable twist of fate that violently accelerated my timeline, but the outcome was flawlessly effective. I did not need to mail Terrence an anonymous file. I did not need to corner him and force him to look at the paperwork. Seeing Leo in the flesh standing right next to Vanessa had done the heavy lifting for me. I checked my watch. We were exactly 7 days out from the wedding. The clock was officially ticking, and the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. My parents and Vanessa were no longer just fighting to protect their social standing from a bitter younger sister. They were now fighting to protect themselves from a senior district attorney who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Terrence was a man who detested being lied to, and he possessed the resources, the authority, and the legal acumen to tear their fabricated history to shreds. I watched Leo step off the pedestal, carefully removing the suit jacket to hand it back to Arthur. The final battle was no longer a distant possibility. It was imminent. Terrence's prosecutorial instincts had been fully triggered, and I knew with absolute certainty that he would not rest until he had unearthed every single buried secret. I just had to hold the line for 7 more days, keeping my son safe and my wedding intact, while my family's empire of lies collapsed completely under the crushing weight of its own deception. The remaining days leading up to the rehearsal dinner felt like holding a lungful of air before diving into freezing water. The tailor shop incident had acted as a massive accelerant, completely shifting the tectonic plates of my family's fragile, fabricated reality. I knew Donovan and Catherine were scrambling frantic to contain the rapidly expanding blast radius of Vanessa's past, but the sheer brazen audacity of their next move still managed to be a breathtaking spectacle of desperation. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a crisp, clear twilight. We pulled up to the Luminary, a notoriously exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant overlooking the glittering city skyline. Gavin had reserved the private glass-enclosed dining room for our intimate rehearsal dinner. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a quiet evening, shared strictly with our bridal party, a few deeply trusted friends, and Gavin's parents. The guest list was tightly controlled, capping at a comfortable 20 people. I walked through the ornate gilded lobby with Gavin's hand resting securely at the small of my back. Leo walking confidently beside us in a crisp button-down shirt and a tailored blazer. He was practically vibrating with excitement, eager to eat fancy food and listen to wedding speeches. We were a unified front, relaxed and ready to celebrate the eve of our new life. But the moment the maitre d' pulled open the heavy brass-studded oak doors to our private suite, the low, sophisticated hum of over 50 unexpected voices hit me like a physical wall. I stopped just inside the threshold, my eyes sweeping the sprawling candlelit room. Donovan and Catherine had not only crashed an event they were explicitly barred from attending, but they had also completely hijacked the logistics. I scanned the sea of faces holding champagne flutes and picking at expensive hors d'oeuvres. It was not just my parents standing by the private bar, trying to look casually authoritative. They had unilaterally invited Terrence's entire extended family. There were aunts dripping in designer silk, uncles swirling expensive scotch in crystal tumblers, and high society cousins looking mildly confused, but perfectly happy to take advantage of an open bar. My forensic accounting mind immediately dissected the architecture of the trap. This was not a peace offering. This was not a misguided attempt at a family reconciliation. This was a highly orchestrated theatrical ambush. Donovan and Catherine intended to use the evening to hold a grand, incredibly public intervention. They had filled the room with influential status-obsessed people to act as their captive audience and their jury. I could see the blueprint of their strategy mapped out in my father's smug, challenging stare across the room. They planned to corner me in front of Terrence's prominent family and paint me as a deeply disturbed, volatile woman. They were going to use Vanessa's forged psychiatric evaluation as their holy grail, spinning a tragic narrative about my supposed mental instability. They wanted to frame me as an unfit mother, harboring dangerous psychotic delusions about a random foster child. The ultimate goal was maximum crippling humiliation. They wanted to exert such overwhelming public pressure, making me look like such an erratic liability, that Gavin would be forced to call off the wedding right then and there to save his own pristine medical reputation. They thought cornering a respected surgeon in front of the city's elite would trigger his sense of self-preservation. They fundamentally misunderstood the man I was marrying. Gavin did not flinch. I felt the muscles in his arm instantly turn to steel, but his face remained a mask of cool, aristocratic, polite indifference. He did not ask me if I wanted to run. He did not pull me backward out the door. Instead, his hand gripped my waist a fraction tighter, and he guided us directly into the lion's den. He led Leo straight to the head of the long, beautifully decorated banquet table, pulling out a chair for him with exaggerated protective care. Leo sat down completely unfazed by the crowd. He happily unfolded his crisp linen napkin, placing it over his lap, and looked up at Gavin with a bright, trusting smile. He was entirely insulated by our love, utterly oblivious to the toxic, venomous machinations swirling in the air above his head. He was safe, and he knew it. I took my seat to the left of Gavin, perfectly composed, my spine ramrod straight. I watched my mother begin to weave her way through the crowd, wearing a sickeningly sweet, manufactured smile, clearly ready to play the role of the deeply concerned, loving matriarch. I leveled a stare at her, so arctic and devoid of fear that she actually faltered in her steps, deciding instead to hover near the floral arrangements. I was not going to run. I was going to let them play their hand and watch it burn them to the ground. As the guests began to take their seats, the room settling into a deceptive, simmering quiet, my eyes drifted down the length of the table. Vanessa was seated near the center, and she looked like a woman who was actively deteriorating from the inside out. The pristine, arrogant, untouchable socialite from the tailor shop was entirely gone. She was already on her third glass of wine before the first course had even been served. Her hand was trembling so violently that the dark red liquid threatened to spill over the rim of the crystal glass onto the white tablecloth. She was hyperventilating, taking shallow, erratic breaths, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered prey animal. She was not socializing. She was not participating in the trap our parents had set. She was paralyzed by the man sitting directly beside her. Terrence sat rigidly in his high-backed chair, barely touching his food or his drink. He was completely unresponsive to the polite chatter of his extended family surrounding him. His demeanor was a terrifying, suffocating void of silence. He was not looking at me. He was not looking at Vanessa. He was watching Leo. Through the flickering glow of the centerpiece candles, Terrence's intense prosecutorial gaze was locked onto the 10-year-old boy sitting happily next to Gavin. Every time Leo laughed at something Gavin said, every time the boy tilted his head or smiled, Terrence's jaw locked tighter. The gears of his brilliant analytical mind were grinding relentlessly, processing the undeniable biological mirror image sitting at the head of the table. Vanessa was drinking heavily, drowning in absolute terror because she knew the truth. The calm before the storm was an illusion. The storm was already inside the room, sitting right next to her, quietly watching his wife's buried past eat a bread roll. The trap my parents had set was about to snap violently shut, but they were completely blind to the fact that they were the ones standing on the trigger. The clinking of fine silver against bone china gradually slowed as the waitstaff moved like silent phantoms around the perimeter of the glass-enclosed dining room, discreetly clearing the remains of the first course. the low, sophisticated murmur of 50 elite guests, creating a steady hum of polite conversation, came to an abrupt, jarring halt. My father, Donovan, pushed back his heavy oak chair. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the polished floorboards, a harsh, abrasive sound that immediately drew every single eye in the room. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and a silver dessert spoon. He tapped the side of the glass. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sliced through the ambient noise, cutting off the gentle background music and demanding absolute, immediate attention. He did not lift his glass in a celebratory gesture toward the bride and groom. He did not offer a warm, welcoming smile. Instead, Donovan let his broad shoulders slump, adopting the heavy-burdened posture of a patriarch carrying an unbearable, agonizing sorrow. He looked down at the pristine white tablecloth for a long theatrical moment, allowing the suspense to build until the silence in the room became thick, heavy, and entirely suffocating. When he finally lifted his head, his gaze bypassed me entirely, fixing instead on Gavin, with a look of manufactured profound pity. He began to speak, his voice projecting across the expansive room, with the polished, authoritative cadence of a seasoned executive addressing a hostile, failing boardroom. He announced to the crowd that he had desperately hoped to spend this evening celebrating a joyous, beautiful union, but his conscience and his strict moral obligation to the truth would no longer allow him to remain silent. He declared that it was the heartbreaking duty of a loving father to protect innocent people from the predators lurking within his own bloodline. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the private suite. Terrence's aunts, uncles, and prominent political cousins exchanged alarmed, wide-eyed glances, their champagne flutes hovering forgotten in the air. Donovan ignored the visible shock rippling through his captive audience and launched headfirst into a masterful, venomous monologue. He loudly proclaimed his immense, enduring grief over the elaborate web of lies I had supposedly spun since my youth. With a voice trembling with fake, calculated emotion, he told the 50 VIP guests that he could no longer hide the shameful reality of my past from the man I intended to marry. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a 19-year-old girl who had suffered a catastrophic psychotic break. He claimed, his voice ringing with faux devastation, that during my sophomore year of college, I had given birth out of wedlock, spiraled into a dangerous, unmanageable delusion, and callously abandoned my own flesh and blood to the state foster system without a single backward glance or shred of maternal remorse. I sat perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the table, listening to my father assassinate my character in front of the city's highest society. He was leveraging the forged psychiatric evaluation Vanessa had illegally procured, spinning it into a tragic, horrifying origin story, designed to instantly turn me into a social pariah. He called me a manipulative sociopath. He used those exact words, letting them hang heavily in the air to ensure maximum irreparable damage. He told the horrified crowd that I had spent years honing my ability to deceive, constructing a flawless, icy corporate facade to mask a deeply disturbed and highly volatile nature. He then turned his focus entirely onto Gavin. My father's voice dropped to a register of urgent paternal concern. He told Gavin that he was a fundamentally good man, a respected surgeon with a pristine, flawless reputation, and that he was currently being conned by a master manipulator. He claimed I was using Gavin to secure a respectable, wealthy life, weaving a toxic trap to ensnare him and ultimately ruin his impeccable medical career. He pointed a rigid finger at me, declaring that my sudden delusional claim over the unrelated foster child sitting at the head of the table was just the latest, most dangerous manifestation of my severe mental sickness. The room fell into a dead, absolute silence. It was the kind of quiet where you could hear the wax dripping from the taper candles and the sound of shallow breathing. Terrence's family sat frozen in their plush seats, their faces pale and locked into masks of utter horror. Wealthy dowagers covered their mouths with manicured hands, while influential businessmen stared at me as if I were a live ticking explosive device. Right on cue, Vanessa initiated her part of the rehearsed performance. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently beneath the silk of her designer dress. She let out a series of muffled, dramatic sobs, perfectly playing the role of the weeping, heartbroken sister who had silently borne the terrible weight of my shameful existence for years. She peeked through her fingers, desperately trying to elicit sympathy from her husband, but Terence remained rigidly still beside her. Catherine moved swiftly behind Vanessa's chair, placing a comforting hand on her back, looking around the room with an expression of stoic maternal devastation. They were executing their script with flawless, terrifying precision. Donovan turned away from Gavin and addressed Terence's powerful family directly. He bowed his head slightly, offering a grand formal apology to the assembled guests. He apologized for dragging them into this humiliating mess, for exposing their respected lineage to the toxic reality of our family dynamic. He expressed his deepest, most profound regrets for my shameful existence, claiming that my actions had tainted the family name, and that he could no longer allow my poison to infect anyone else in polite society. Then he delivered his final decisive blow. He looked straight into Gavin's eyes, channeling all the arrogant, commanding authority he possessed. Donovan demanded that Gavin leave me immediately. He ordered my future husband to stand up, walk away from the table, and call off the wedding right then and there. He framed it as an act of desperate salvation, begging Gavin to pack his things and leave me to my sickness before I dragged him down into my inevitable, highly public ruin. The trap had been fully deployed. My father stood at the end of the long banquet table, his chest heaving slightly, waiting for his ultimate victory. He expected Gavin to look at me with disgust and fear. He expected the room to erupt into chaotic whispers of condemnation. He expected me to shatter under the unbearable, crushing weight of public humiliation. I did not shatter. I did not cry. I slowly turned my head to look at Gavin, whose hand was resting firmly and securely over mine under the table. His pulse was steady. His grip was an iron anchor. He looked back at me, his dark eyes reflecting a cold, furious calm that mirrored my own. We had anticipated a desperate move, but the sheer public magnitude of Donovan's lie was a fatal miscalculation. They had built their entire ambush on the assumption that shame would force us into submission. But I felt absolutely no shame, only the cold, sharp thrill of knowing that my father had just handed me the match to burn his empire to ash. The match had been struck, and the 50 influential guests in the room waited with bated breath for me to burn. Terence's aunts, uncles, and prominent political cousins sat frozen in their plush seats, their eyes darting between my father's condemning posture and my seated form. They fully expected me to shatter. They anticipated a tearful breakdown, a hysterical denial, or a humiliating retreat out the heavy oak doors. They expected me to fulfill the exact tragic, volatile role my father had just so masterfully outlined. Instead, I did not shed a single tear. I did not scream, gasp, or leap from my chair to defend myself. I simply turned my head and looked at Gavin. Underneath the heavy white tablecloth, his fingers were still locked securely around mine, his pulse steady and completely unbothered. I looked into his dark, intelligent eyes and gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Gavin did not look at my father with the horror or revulsion of a betrayed fiancé. He looked at Donovan with the cold, sterile detachment of a skilled surgeon examining a diseased organ that desperately needed to be excised from a healthy body. Slowly, Gavin released my hand. He pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the floorboards in a deliberate, unhurried counterpoint to my father's earlier dramatic gesture. He stood up to his full height, casually buttoning the center button of his tailored suit jacket with an air of absolute, unshakable authority. A ripple of expectant murmurs washed over the captive audience. My father's chest puffed out a triumphant, smug gleam lighting up his eyes. Donovan clearly believed he had won. He fully expected Gavin to walk toward the exit to demand his ring back, to publicly wash his hands of me just as instructed. But Gavin did not walk toward the heavy oak doors. He turned his back on the exit entirely and walked with purposeful, measured strides toward the far end of the private dining suite. The Luminary, being a premier venue for high society events, featured a state-of-the-art discreetly integrated media system typically utilized for projecting tasteful photo montages or corporate presentations during private dinners. Gavin approached the sleek audio-visual console built into the mahogany wall paneling. He reached into his breast pocket, retrieved his smartphone, and smoothly connected a waiting cable into the base of his device. My father's smug smile began to falter, the edges of his confidence fraying as confusion set in. He lowered his champagne flute, his brow furrowing as he watched Gavin tap a sequence onto his phone screen. With a low mechanical hum, a massive concealed projection screen descended from a recessed slot in the ceiling, unrolling directly behind where Donovan was currently standing. The ambient romantic lighting in the dining room automatically dimmed in response to the system's activation. Suddenly, the expansive blank canvas behind my father was illuminated by a blindingly bright high-definition projection. It was not a montage of childhood memories. It was not a collection of romantic engagement photos. It was a stark clinical and flawlessly clear scan of a highly classified legal document. The sheer size of the projection made the stark black text impossible to ignore. The official state seal loomed at the very top of the header, crisp and authoritative, projecting a bureaucratic weight that instantly suffocated the theatrical melodrama my father had just performed. The guests sitting at the far end of the banquet table squinted, their expressions morphing from morbid curiosity to profound, genuine bewilderment as they processed the unmistakable format of a government form. Gavin turned away from the console and faced the crowd. He did not raise his voice to a shout, but his natural commanding baritone filled the room, demanding absolute submission from everyone present. Since Donovan has so graciously decided to make deeply personal family history a matter of public record tonight, Gavin began, his tone dripping with lethal, aristocratic politeness. I believe it is only fair and just that we rely on actual time-stamped, legally binding facts rather than indulging in fabricated, hysterical fiction. Gavin stepped closer to the massive screen, his tall frame casting a long, sharp shadow over the bottom corner of the document. He gestured toward the bolded, capitalized text at the top of the form. He began to read the boilerplate legal jargon aloud, his cadence unrelenting and completely merciless. This is a State Department of Children and Families' formal relinquishment of parental rights and consent to adoption. Gavin projected, ensuring every syllable landed like a physical blow across the silent room. The document is dated exactly 10 years ago. It outlines the irrevocable voluntary surrender of a male infant, relinquishing all physical, legal, and emotional claims to the child in question. The air in the room seemed to physically drop 10 degrees. The horrifying tale of my teenage psychotic break was instantly evaporating, replaced by the cold, undeniable gravity of state-sanctioned paperwork. I watched my mother take a stumbling, erratic step backward. Her carefully constructed mask of maternal devastation completely vaporized, melting into genuine naked panic. She reached out to grip the back of an empty chair, her knuckles turning bone white. My father stood frozen in place. He was trapped between the glowing wall behind him and the 50 pairs of eyes that were suddenly burning into his skin. The color drained from Donovan's face with sickening speed, leaving his complexion an awful mottled gray. Gavin tapped his phone screen again. The projection on the wall seamlessly zoomed in, magnifying the bottom section of the legal form until the signature blocks were practically 10 feet tall, glowing bright and undeniable for the entire room to witness. "Let us review the signatures on this sworn relinquishment," Gavin said, his voice cutting through the dead air like a scalpel. "Let us see the name of the biological mother, the woman who willfully, legally, and permanently signed away her rights to this child 10 years ago." Gavin did not say my name. He did not even look at me. He kept his eyes locked squarely on the terrified faces of my parents as he read the name aloud. He read the elegant, looping, unmistakable cursive signature that filled the massive screen. Vanessa. The name rang out like a gunshot. The entire room physically recoiled. A collective, horrified gasp erupted from Terrence's extended family. Crystal glasses clattered harshly against porcelain plates. The theatrical fake sobbing that had been coming from Vanessa's chair ceased instantly, violently cut off, as if she had been plunged underwater. She shrank back into the upholstery, making a horrific choking sound as she stared up at her own 10-foot-tall signature, a signature on a document surrendering a child she had sworn to her husband never existed. But Gavin was not finished executing the reversal, and as the state law strictly requires, Gavin continued, his voice echoing over the rising tide of shocked whispers. Such a profound, permanent legal surrender requires official sworn witnesses to verify the identity and intent of the mother. Gavin shifted the projection a fraction of an inch downward, exposing the two signature lines directly beneath Vanessa's looping cursive. He did not need to raise his voice. The absolute finality of the evidence did all the necessary damage. The witnesses who stood in that room, Gavin read his tone laced with absolute disgust. The individuals who verified this surrender and who have spent the last 10 years burying this truth to protect their own social standing. He read the final two names with devastating crystal clarity: Donovan and Catherine. The names Donovan and Catherine hung in the air, a death knell to their carefully curated empire of lies. For a fraction of a second, the private dining suite was trapped in a vacuum of stunned comprehension. Then the room erupted. The sophisticated, polite silence shattered into absolute pandemonium. Gasps echoed off the glass walls. The wealthy aunts and prominent uncles of Terrence's extended family broke into a chorus of outraged, horrified whispers, physically recoiling from my parents as if they were suddenly contagious. A crystal wine glass shattered against the hardwood floor, dropped by a trembling hand, but the sharp sound was instantly drowned out by a sound much worse. "Turn it off!" Vanessa shrieked. She vaulted out of her chair with such violent, erratic force that the heavy wooden frame tipped backward, crashing into the carpet behind her. She lunged toward the projection screen, her arms flailing wildly, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The elegant, composed socialite had completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. "It is a forgery!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch that scraped against the eardrums of everyone present. "Turn that screen off right now." She made this up. "Blair is insane. She fabricated the entire thing because she is jealous of me. Terrence, you have to believe me. It is a lie. She is trying to ruin my life with fake documents." She reached out to grab her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers clawing at his suit jacket, but Terrence yanked his arm out of her grasp with a look of profound, chilling revulsion. He did not say a word to her. His eyes remained locked on the 10-foot-tall signature illuminated on the wall. Gavin did not argue with my sister's frantic, shrieking denials. He did not engage with her hysterics or offer a single syllable of debate. He simply looked at her with an expression of icy, clinical disdain, turned back to the audio-visual console, and tapped his smartphone screen one more time. The state relinquishment form vanished from the wall. In its place, a new, equally massive document materialized, glowing brightly against the dim lighting of the dining room. It was a legally certified court, admissible DNA diagnostic report from one of the most premier, stringently regulated genetic testing laboratories in the country. The official seal's barcodes and notarized stamps bordered the page, eliminating any possible margin for error or accusation of forgery. Gavin zoomed in on the conclusion matrix at the bottom of the page, blowing the bold black text up so large that even the guests at the furthest corners of the suite could read it with absolute clarity. Gavin turned his back on the screen and faced the stunned crowd, his voice cutting cleanly through Vanessa's fading, breathless sobs. Since we are apparently questioning the validity of state records, Gavin projected his tone laced with a dangerous, righteous authority. Let us consult biology. What you are looking at is a legally mandated chain of custody genetic test conducted precisely to navigate the foster care system my fiancé was forced to battle. He pointed sharply at the glowing data behind him. Probability of maternity between Blair and the child. Leo Gavin read, his voice vibrating with unwavering conviction. 0.0%. She is not his mother. She never was. He shifted his finger down to the next highlighted line. Probability of avuncular relationship. Gavin continued, making sure every single person in the room absorbed the words. 99.9%. Blair is not a sociopath trying to trap a doctor with a delusional narrative. She is the biological aunt of the boy sitting at this table. A boy who was thrown away like an inconvenient piece of trash by the very people claiming to be the victims tonight. The room fell into a stunned, breathless paralysis. The undeniable scientific proof radiated from the wall, stripping Donovan and Catherine of their last remaining shred of plausible deniability. My father stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently, the arrogant patriarch utterly demolished by a single slide. Gavin stepped forward, placing himself protectively between me and the rest of the room. When he spoke again, the clinical detachment vanished, replaced by a passionate, fierce devotion that made my chest ache. "You came here tonight to execute a public character assassination," Gavin said, his gaze fixed dead on Donovan. "You tried to frame the woman I love as a monster to save your own pathetic, fragile social standing. Let me tell you exactly who Blair is." Gavin's voice swelled, commanding the absolute attention of every VIP guest, every silent waiter, and every horrified member of Terrence's family. "While your golden daughter was living a life of luxury, and while you two were busy burying a child to protect a country club membership, Blair was doing the impossible," Gavin declared. "She spent the last decade of her life searching. She hired private investigators. She fought through miles of bureaucratic red tape and sealed court records in a broken, opaque foster system. She spent every dime of her personal savings, sacrificing her own youth and her own comfort to track down a nephew she had never even met." I looked down at the table, my vision blurring slightly, feeling the overwhelming weight of those long, lonely years finally being dragged into the light. Leo reached over and took my hand, his small fingers wrapping securely around mine. "She did not abandon anyone," Gavin continued, his voice ringing with absolute pride. "She walked into a system designed to keep secrets, and she tore it apart until she found him. She rescued this boy from the isolation you condemned him to. She brought him home. She is not a liability. She is the strongest, bravest, most deeply honorable woman I have ever had the privilege of knowing." Gavin looked around the suite, letting his words sink into the silent, captivated audience. The aunts and uncles who had looked at me with suspicion moments earlier were now staring at me with profound, unmistakable awe. "You thought you could corner me into abandoning her?" Gavin finished, his voice dropping to a low, lethal promise. "You thought bringing your influential friends here would force my hand. You were right about one thing. I am making a choice tonight. I am choosing the woman who saves people over the cowards who throw them away." The silence that followed his declaration was absolute, ringing with the crushing, undeniable weight of the truth. Donovan and Catherine were completely trapped, stripped of their power, their weapons shattered against the unyielding wall of Gavin's defense. Vanessa remained on the floor, weeping uncontrollably, entirely exposed. The trap had closed, but the architects were the ones caught in the steel teeth. The absolute silence that followed Gavin's declaration was entirely different from the shocked hush that had preceded it. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, the kind that settles over a courtroom moments before a devastating verdict is read aloud. Every eye in the private suite instinctively drifted away from the glowing projection screen, away from my father's gray, paralyzed face, and gravitated toward the single man who now held the absolute power to dictate the fallout. Terrence moved. He did not rush, nor did he display any of the chaotic, manic energy that was currently ripping his wife apart on the floor beside him. He placed his hands flat on the edge of the mahogany banquet table and slowly pushed himself up to his full, imposing height. As a senior district attorney, Terrence made a living dissecting lies, finding the fatal flaws in fabricated alibis, and dismantling perjured testimonies with ruthless efficiency. Watching him stand there, I could practically see the terrifyingly brilliant machinery of his mind, engaging, processing the staggering volume of evidence Gavin had just laid out and aligning it with the discrepancies he had been secretly cataloging for weeks. The pieces of the puzzle were snapping together with brutal, undeniable clarity. He looked at Leo, really looked at him, recognizing the sharp, sweeping slope of the cheekbones and the distinct, stubborn set of the jawline he saw staring back at him every morning in his own bathroom mirror. He remembered the unexplainable, frantic panic at Arthur's tailor shop. He processed Donovan and Catherine's desperate, highly orchestrated attempt to preemptively destroy my credibility tonight with a fake intervention. It all coalesced into one undeniable, monstrous truth. Terence slowly turned his head, tearing his gaze away from the boy at the head of the table, and looked down at the woman cowering near his polished leather shoes. Vanessa was a wretched, trembling mess of ruined designer silk and smeared mascara. She was desperately clutching at the hem of his trousers, her knuckles white, her breath coming in ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She knew the executioner had arrived. Terence did not yell. He did not raise his voice to match the theatrical hysteria my parents had employed. He spoke in a tone so deadly quiet, so entirely devoid of warmth or marital affection, that the sheer frigidity of it sent a visible shiver down the spine of his nearest aunt. Vanessa Terence said the name sounding like a foreign, distasteful word on his tongue. "Look at me." She shook her head frantically, burying her face into her hands, refusing to meet his eye. She was trying to hide from the blinding light of her own exposed sociopathy. But Terence was a man who demanded the truth, no matter how ugly the extraction process proved to be. He reached down, his movements completely mechanical, and gripped her wrist, peeling her hands away from her tear-streaked face with undeniable force. "I am going to ask you one question." Terence continued, his voice vibrating with a dark, contained fury that was far more terrifying than any shouting match. "And you are going to answer me with the absolute truth, or I swear to God I will have you removed from this building by security. Did you abandon your child to marry me?" The question hung over the dining table, brutal and precise. It was the ultimate cross-examination, stripping away the forged psychiatric evaluations, the fake interventions, and the decades of carefully cultivated high society polish. There was nowhere left for her to run. The DNA was projected on the wall. The state relinquishment form bore her signature. Her parents were frozen in silent, cowardly complicity. Vanessa broke. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail, a sound completely devoid of her usual manufactured grace. Her knees gave out entirely and she collapsed completely onto the floor, her body folding into a posture of absolute, pathetic surrender. "I had to," she sobbed, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a frantic, desperate rush of self-preservation. "Terence, please. You have to understand. I was 19. I was a child myself. And your family is a dynasty. You are all pedigree and political connections and flawless social standing. Your mother made it perfectly clear what kind of woman was acceptable for you. You were a rising star in the prosecutor's office. You would never have looked twice at a teenage single mother. You would never have chosen me. I loved you too much to lose you before I even had you. I did it for us. I did it so we could have this perfect life." Her confession echoed through the glass-enclosed suite, confirming every horrifying suspicion, every calculated manipulation. She had not abandoned her son out of fear or lack of resources or coercion. She had thrown Leo away like a piece of discarded luggage simply because he did not fit into the pristine, wealthy aesthetic she required to secure a marriage to a powerful man. She had sacrificed her own flesh and blood on the altar of her own vanity. The reaction from Terence's family was instantaneous and visceral. The aunts who had previously looked at me with deep suspicion now stared at Vanessa with unmasked, profound revulsion. An uncle muttered something sharp and disgusted under his breath. The entire political dynasty Vanessa had bled her own child to impress was now looking at her as if she were a toxic, abhorrent mutation. Terence looked down at the woman weeping at his feet, and the expression on his face was a terrifying, absolute void. The last remnants of his shock had burned away, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated disgust. He was looking at a stranger, a moral counterfeit, who had built their entire marriage on a foundation of unforgivable cruelty. "You did not do this for us," Terence stated, his voice ringing with a final, chilling clarity. "You did this because you are an empty, soulless void of a human being." He reached down to his left hand. With slow, deliberate precision, he grasped the thick gold wedding band resting on his ring finger. Vanessa gasped, realizing exactly what he was doing. She reached up her hands, scrambling uselessly against his suit jacket, begging him to stop, promising she would do anything to fix it, pleading with him not to throw away 4 years of marriage. Terence ignored her entirely. He slid the gold band over his knuckle, freeing his hand from the symbol of their union. He held the ring suspended in the air for a single heartbeat. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he dropped it. The heavy gold ring fell, striking the edge of Vanessa's half-empty crystal wine glass. It made a sharp, high-pitched clink before plunging into the dark red liquid, sinking straight to the bottom and resting there like a drowned, discarded relic. Terence did not spare his wife another glance. He turned his back on her sobbing form and looked directly at his assembled relatives. His posture was rigid, his jaw set in stone. "We are leaving," Terence commanded, his voice projecting across the room with the unwavering authority of a man taking absolute control of a catastrophic situation. "Everyone, right now, do not speak to them. Do not engage. Gather your things and walk out that door." The compliance was immediate and total. The 50 VIP guests, the aunts in their designer silks, the uncles with their expensive scotch, all moved as one unified, horrified entity. They rose from their chairs, casting deeply repulsed glances at my parents and the woman weeping on the floor. There were no goodbyes. There were no polite farewells. There was only the rustle of expensive fabric and the hurried, heavy footsteps of an entire dynasty fleeing a contaminated room. Terence led the exodus, marching out the heavy brass-studded oak doors without ever looking back, leaving the architects of the trap completely buried in the rubble of their own making. The heavy oak doors had barely swung shut behind Terence's retreating figure when the paralysis gripping my parents finally shattered. Donovan and Catherine snapped out of their horrified stupor as the sheer magnitude of their loss materialized in front of them. For my parents, watching Terence walk out of that dining room was not merely witnessing the dissolution of their daughter's marriage, it was the catastrophic, spectacular collapse of their entire social and political infrastructure. Terence represented the absolute pinnacle of their relentless networking, the golden ticket that granted them unquestioned access to elite circles and unassailable prestige. Losing him meant losing their leverage, their untouchable status, and their future ambitions. Donovan bellowed a desperate, panicked command, the polished executive facade entirely stripped away to reveal a frantic, terrified man. He lunged toward the exit, Catherine trailing hot on his heels, her designer shoes clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. They pushed past the few remaining bewildered restaurant staff members, completely abandoning their weeping daughter on the carpet to chase after the vanishing coattails of their political capital. I remained seated, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold through the glass partition of the private dining suite. Donovan reached the gilded lobby of the Luminary, desperately attempting to physically intercept Terence before he reached the bank of private elevators. But Terence was a high-profile senior district attorney, and he did not travel unprotected. 2 men in sharp, dark suits materialized instantly from the shadows of the lobby. Terence's private security detail moved with brutal, practiced efficiency. They stepped directly into Donovan's path, forming an impenetrable physical wall of solid muscle. Donovan collided with the nearest guard, stumbling backward in shock. Catherine shrieked, grabbing her husband's arm to steady him, her face flushed with indignity. The security detail did not flinch, their expressions remaining blank and completely unyielding. They raised their hands, physically blocking my parents from taking another step toward the elevators. Through the thick glass, I watched Terence step into the waiting car, never once turning his head to witness the groveling display happening just yards away. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing my parents' fate and cementing their absolute social exile. Donovan and Catherine stood in the opulent lobby for a long, agonizing moment, staring at the closed elevator doors as the reality of their complete ruin settled heavily over their shoulders. Defeated, thoroughly and publicly humiliated, and stripped of their most prized asset, they slowly turned and trudged back into the private suite. The energy they brought back into the room was intensely toxic, a volatile, dangerous mixture of profound panic and cornered rage. Vanessa had managed to drag herself off the floor, slumping into a chair. Her makeup was smeared across her cheeks in dark, chaotic streaks. She was inconsolable, rocking back and forth, mourning the permanent loss of the wealth and status she had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to obtain. Catherine took one look at her ruined golden child and then snapped her head toward me. The panic in her eyes instantly transmuted into a blazing, hysterical fury. She marched back to the banquet table, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. She slammed her palms flat against the pristine white linen, leaning over the table to glare at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "Look at what you have done," Catherine hissed, her voice vibrating with a shrill, frantic desperation. "You ruined your sister's life. You humiliated us in front of the most important people in this city. You orchestrated this entire spectacle just to destroy everything we have built." I sat perfectly still, observing her meltdown with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a highly predictable chemical reaction. She was entirely incapable of accountability. Even now, standing knee-deep in the smoldering wreckage of a malicious trap she had set herself, she was desperately trying to force me to carry the blame. "You are going to fix this," Catherine demanded, her voice escalating into a full-blown, echoing scream. "You are going to march out there. You are going to call Terrence, and you are going to tell him you lied. You will tell him that document was a fake, that this was all a terrible, tragic misunderstanding. You will fix this right now, Blair." Donovan stepped up beside her, his face flushed a dark, dangerous purple. "Your mother is exactly right," he barked, pointing a trembling, accusing finger directly at my face. "You owe this family. You owe your sister for the damage you have caused tonight. You will correct this narrative immediately, or I promise you, I will make sure you never work in this state again." I did not raise my voice. I did not match their manic, screaming energy. I simply reached down to the floor beside my chair and picked up my leather tote bag. I unfastened the brass clasp and reached inside, my movements slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. Gavin stood beside me, a silent, unyielding guardian, while Leo watched the scene with wide, highly intelligent eyes, fully aware that we held all the power in the room. I pulled a thick, heavy manila envelope from my bag. It was stuffed to the brim, the edges physically bulging with the sheer volume of paperwork contained inside. I held it up for a moment, letting Donovan and Catherine stare at it, letting the anticipation twist the knife a fraction deeper. Then, with a resounding, heavy thud, I dropped the envelope directly onto the table right between my mother's braced hands. "I am not fixing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial absolute zero. "I am simply balancing the books." Donovan stared down at the bloated envelope, his heavy brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this garbage?" That I replied, leaning slightly forward, resting my forearms on the table, "is a comprehensive, fully audited invoice. It details every single dollar I have spent over the last 5 years cleaning up Vanessa's mess. It includes the hefty retainers for the private investigators I hired to track down the son she threw away. It includes the exorbitant legal fees I paid to navigate the foster system and fight the state. It includes the specialized therapy, the medical bills, the school tuition, the clothing, the food, and the basic everyday costs of raising a growing child that your golden daughter abandoned like an inconvenient piece of trash." Vanessa let out a sharp, wounded gasp from her chair, her hands flying to cover her mouth, but I did not spare her a single glance. I kept my gaze locked intensely on my parents. "You claim I owe this family," I continued, my tone slicing cleanly through the remaining tension in the room. "The reality is that you owe me. I have bankrolled the preservation of your precious, fragile family secret for half a decade. Every receipt, every bank transfer, every legal filing is meticulously documented and categorized in that envelope. You are going to reimburse me for every last cent." Catherine stared at the thick package as if it were a live, venomous snake, her mouth opening and closing repeatedly without producing a single sound. The sheer audacity of the demand, backed by the terrifyingly organized proof resting in front of her, had short-circuited her ability to scream. "And there is one more item at the very top of that stack," I added, delivering the final crushing blow. "It is a legally binding judge-signed restraining order. I secured it this morning with the help of a very competent, very aggressive legal team utilizing the security footage from the tailor shop and the documented history of your relentless harassment. I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in 29 years. I looked down at the three broken, pathetic figures who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and crazy. They were finally seeing the architect of their own demise. "Pay the bill," I commanded, my voice echoing through the suite with absolute, unshakable finality. "And stay 500 feet away from my son." I turned on my heel, slipping my hand back into Gavin's waiting palm, while my other hand rested protectively on Leo's shoulder. We walked out of the private dining suite together, the heavy mahogany doors swinging shut on the suffocating silence we left behind. We did not look back. Stepping out of the luminary and into the crisp night air felt like taking my first real breath in nearly 3 decades. The crushing weight of my family's expectations, their constant belittling comparisons, and their toxic secrets evaporated into the darkness. We were finally free, stepping into a future that belonged entirely to us. The fallout from that catastrophic dinner was spectacular, absolute, and mercilessly swift. News of the confrontation spread through Terrence's extended family like a virulent contagion, and from there it bled instantly into the upper echelons of the city's social registry. The pristine, highly curated life my sister had ruthlessly constructed for herself imploded entirely within a matter of days. Terrence did not hesitate. He did not ask for couples counseling, nor did he entertain the idea of private mediation to save face. He filed for a divorce that was as rapid as it was utterly devastating. As a senior district attorney, Terrence understood the mechanics of the law intimately, and he utilized every single facet of his legal expertise to dismantle his marriage. He bypassed standard divorce proceedings and triggered a heavily ironclad moral turpitude clause buried deep within the fine print of their prenuptial agreement. The clause, originally drafted by his family's aggressive legal team to protect their political assets from public scandals, was executed with lethal precision. Vanessa's deliberate, documented abandonment of her biological child to secure a wealthy marriage was deemed an act of profound moral depravity. The presiding judge reviewed the certified DNA results and the state relinquishment forms and agreed without a fraction of hesitation. The resulting court order was an absolute bloodbath. The ruling stripped Vanessa of any right to alimony, spousal support, or the exorbitant marital assets she had grown so accustomed to flaunting. She was legally forced to vacate their sprawling downtown penthouse within 72 hours. She dragged her designer suitcases out to the curb with absolutely nowhere to go and no vast fortune to fall back on. The golden child, who had spent her entire life believing she was untouchable, was rendered entirely destitute. She was permanently exiled from the only world she deemed worthy of her presence, reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among the social elite. The devastation, however, did not stop at my sister. The blast radius of the scandal swallowed my parents whole, vaporizing their precious social standing and their deeply entrenched political leverage. Donovan had spent decades building his manufacturing empire by heavily piggybacking on the influence and deep pockets of Terrence's powerful family. He had shamelessly leveraged his daughter's high-profile marriage to secure massive investments, lucrative corporate contracts, and unprecedented access to untouchable supply chains. The exact moment Terrence dropped his wedding ring into that wine glass, that entire network was abruptly and violently severed. Terrence's formidable father made a single decisive phone call to his investment board. By the time the markets opened the next morning, every single dollar of their capital was aggressively withdrawn from my father's enterprise. The sudden gaping vacuum of funding triggered a catastrophic financial chain reaction. Other major investors, sensing the rapid shift in the political wind and terrified of angering Terrence's powerful dynasty, immediately followed suit. Vital contracts were abruptly canceled. Under dubious but unassailable legal technicalities, critical supply lines dried up overnight. Donovan's company, once a revered titan of local industry, was sent into an unrecoverable tailspin. Within 3 short weeks, my father was facing a barrage of relentless lawsuits from panicked shareholders. He was cornered, outmatched, and forced into a humiliating, highly publicized corporate bankruptcy. The arrogant patriarch, who had constantly threatened to cut me off financially, who had leveraged his wealth to control every aspect of my existence, was suddenly drowning in an ocean of insurmountable debt. His pristine business reputation was permanently reduced to ash. While my father watched his financial empire burn to the ground, my mother suffered a punishment perfectly tailored to her specific brand of narcissism. Catherine's entire identity was inextricably tied to her elite social calendar, her prominent charity galas, and her unquestioned authority among the city's wealthiest wives. The society she so desperately worshipped and sacrificed me for turned on her with breathtaking speed. The dismantling of her social life began with a stark, legally worded letter delivered via certified mail directly to their front door. The prestigious ultra-exclusive country club that had served as Catherine's second home and primary stage for decades voted unanimously to revoke their family membership. The board cited a severe violation of the club's strict code of conduct regarding public scandals and moral standing. That formal revocation was merely the beginning of her absolute exile. The wealthy socialites who had once fawned over Catherine, eagerly seeking her approval and religiously attending her lavish luncheons, now treated her like a complete pariah. Her phone calls went completely unanswered. Her long-standing invitations to highly coveted charity boards were silently but firmly rescinded. When she dared to show her face at a local high-end boutique or a favorite bistro, former friends would literally turn their backs crossing the street to avoid breathing the same air. The hushed whispers that followed her were no longer murmurs of admiration, but venomous gossip about the callous monster who had forced her own daughter to raise her discarded grandchild. She was entirely excised from high society, left to rot in a silent, empty mansion that they would soon be unable to afford, trapped in the prison of her own ruined reputation. The memory of that spectacular fiery collapse faded into the quiet, steady rhythm of the present. 18 months had passed since the night the earth swallowed my family whole, and as I opened my eyes to the soft golden light filtering through the sheer curtains of the bridal suite, I felt an absolute profound stillness. Today was my wedding day. If my mother had been allowed anywhere near this morning, the sprawling suite at the coastal botanical estate would have been a suffocating battlefield. There would have been shrill, frantic screaming over the floral arrangements. There would have been vicious, passive-aggressive critiques regarding my waistline, my posture, and my choice of makeup. The air would have been thick with a toxic, heavy anxiety every single moment, micromanaged to serve Catherine's fragile, demanding ego. Instead, the room was filled with the rich, melodic sound of genuine laughter and the gentle rhythm of ocean waves crashing against the cliffs outside. The heavy, dark cloud that had hovered over my entire childhood was entirely gone. In its place was a bright, unburdened peace. I sat in front of the gilded vanity mirror, wrapped in a plush silk robe, sipping a cup of rich espresso, while my favorite playlist hummed softly from a portable speaker. My true support system surrounded me, a chosen family, forged in fire and loyalty. Gavin's 3 older sisters, Sarah, Elena, and Chloe, had commandeered the velvet sofas near the balcony. They were fiercely protective, vibrant women who had instantly and unconditionally embraced me and Leo as their own flesh and blood. They were currently passing around a silver tray of warm powdered pastries, swapping embarrassing, highly exaggerated childhood stories about Gavin, their boisterous laughter echoing cheerfully off the high vaulted ceilings. There was no judgment in their eyes, no silent calculations of my worth. They treated me with a warmth and sisterhood I had never experienced in my own bloodline. My 2 best friends, Maya and Harper women, who had held my hand through the darkest, most agonizing days of the foster system battles, were stationed beside me. Harper popped the cork on a bottle of vintage champagne with a triumphant cheer, the celebratory pop causing us all to jump and laugh. She poured the sparkling liquid into crystal flutes, handing me one with a brilliant, tearful smile. Maya stood behind my chair, carefully pinning delicate white blossoms into my curled hair, her touch gentle and reassuring. They did not demand perfection or compliance from me. They simply offered unwavering, absolute support. The love in the room was a tangible physical presence wrapping around me like a protective shield. The heavy wooden door to the adjoining suite swung open, and the breath completely caught in my throat. Leo marched into the room, his small shoulders thrown back, radiating an immense, adorable amount of pride. He was dressed in a custom, perfectly tailored navy blue suit, an exact miniature replica of the garment Gavin was currently putting on down the hall. A crisp white shirt, a tiny dark silk bow tie, and polished brown leather shoes completed the immaculate ensemble. He looked impossibly handsome, healthy, and vibrantly alive. He was taking his official duties today very seriously. In his hands, he clutched a small ivory velvet ring pillow completely devoid of the actual rings which Gavin's best man was currently guarding with his life. Leo paced across the plush carpet, counting his steps under his breath, practicing the exact measured cadence we had rehearsed for his walk down the aisle. He paused, turned precisely 90 degrees, and offered a serious professional nod to an imaginary officiant. Gavin's sisters completely melted. They abandoned their pastries and rushed over to him, cooing and cheering him on, snapping dozens of photos on their phones as he struck a rigid, highly dignified pose at the end of his practice aisle. Sarah adjusted his lapel, praising his excellent posture, while Elena assured him he was going to be the most handsome man at the entire estate. Leo soaked up the attention, a bright, dimpled smile breaking through his serious facade. The shadows that used to haunt his eyes when he first came home to me, the lingering ghosts of neglect and systemic isolation, were entirely gone. They had been completely eradicated, replaced by the bright, unshakable confidence of a boy who knew, without a single fraction of a doubt, that he was the absolute center of our universe. I set my crystal champagne flute down on the vanity and walked over to him. The women in the room respectfully stepped back, giving us the space. I dropped to my knees so we were exactly eye to eye, the expensive silk of my robe pooling on the carpet around me. I reached out and gently straightened his tiny bow tie, my fingers lingering on his warm, healthy cheek. "Are you ready for your big mission today?" I asked, keeping my tone properly solemn. Leo nodded vigorously, gripping the velvet pillow tighter. "I have to walk slow," he recited, his voice filled with determination. "I have to stand next to Gavin and I cannot drop the pillow. I am going to do a perfect job." "I know you are," I whispered, a wave of profound emotion washing over me. "You are my brave boy." He grinned, dropping his professional demeanor entirely, and threw his arms around my neck in a tight, uninhibited hug. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of his lavender shampoo, feeling his small heart beating steadily against my chest. As I hugged my son back, I looked up and caught my reflection in the tall vanity mirror. The woman looking back at me was not a victim. She was not a disappointment, an outcast, or a placeholder designed to be pushed aside. She was a mother, a survivor, and a bride about to marry a man who loved her fiercely and completely. There was absolutely zero anxiety twisting in my gut. There were no ghosts hiding in the corners of the room. There was only the brilliant, blinding light of the future we had fought so desperately to build. Harper gently took the empty crystal champagne flute from my hand, a silent signal that our time in the peaceful sanctuary of the bridal suite had finally come to an end. We made our way down the wide, sunlit corridors of the coastal estate, moving with a quiet, deliberate grace toward the botanical glasshouse. This was the exact venue Catherine had fought tooth and nail to commandeer for her own endless social conquests. It was the breathtaking architectural marvel she had ruthlessly demanded I surrender so Vanessa could host a hollow, performative vow renewal. Walking into the massive, soaring structure now entirely on my own terms and surrounded only by people who genuinely cared for me was the ultimate silent victory over the family that had tried to erase me. The glass house was an absolute masterpiece of wrought iron and crystal-clear panes rising high into the thick canopy of ancient sprawling oak trees. Exotic emerald green ferns and vibrant orchids cascaded elegantly from the heavy steel rafters, while thousands of tiny warm fairy lights were meticulously woven through the living vines that climbed the structural pillars. The late afternoon sun poured directly through the vaulted glass ceiling, bathing the rows of dark wooden chairs and our gathered guests in a soft, ethereal golden glow. It was not a sterile, heavily staged pageant designed to impress wealthy, judgmental strangers. It was an intimate, deeply meaningful gathering of the chosen family who had actively stood by us through the darkest chapters of our lives. The string quartet positioned near the front altar shifted their melody, the rich, resonant notes of a cello signaling the beginning of the processional. The heavy glass and iron doors swung open. Gavin's sisters walked down the aisle first, their smiles radiant and undeniably genuine, bringing a joyful, relaxed energy into the room. Maya and Harper followed close behind, their steady, comforting presence, a beautiful tribute to the years they had spent keeping me anchored to reality when my own blood relatives were trying to convince me I was losing my mind. Then it was Leo's turn. He stepped forward onto the pristine white runner, his small hands gripping the velvet ring pillow with absolute, unwavering determination. He did not rush. He took his time, his face a mask of adorable, intense concentration as he counted his steps just as we had practiced. A collective, audible sigh of endearment rippled through the guests as they watched him march forward. When he reached the altar, Gavin immediately knelt down, whispering something into Leo's ear that made my son beam with radiant pride before taking his designated spot at the front. The music swelled, transitioning into a triumphant, sweeping melody, and it was my turn. Traditionally, a father walks his daughter down the aisle to give her away to her new husband. Donovan had forfeited that right long ago through decades of neglect and emotional abuse, and I had absolutely no desire to replace him with a symbolic stand-in. I did not need to be given away. I belonged entirely to myself. I stepped into the glass house alone, my head held high, the long train of my ivory silk gown gliding softly over the white rose petals scattered across the floor. I felt the warmth of the sun on my face and an overwhelming, beautiful surge of emotion as my eyes locked onto Gavin. He was standing at the end of the aisle, looking incredibly handsome in his tailored dark suit, his eyes shining with unshed tears as he watched me approach. When I finally reached the altar, I did not hand my bouquet to a bridesmaid. I placed it gently on a nearby pedestal so I could keep my hands completely free to take both of Gavin's. The officiant began the ceremony, speaking eloquent words about love, endurance, and commitment, but the entire world outside of the man standing in front of me completely faded away. When the time came for us to exchange our personalized vows, the silence in the glass house was absolute, broken only by the rustle of the leaves above us and the distant rhythmic sound of the ocean. I looked deep into the eyes of the man who had seen every fractured piece of my life and helped me build an impenetrable fortress out of the ruins. "I promised you once that I would never stop fighting for my peace." I began, my voice clear and projecting steadily through the vast sunlit room. I spent my entire life believing that love was conditional, a fragile prize to be earned through silent obedience and erased boundaries. You taught me that true love does not demand surrender. It demands equal partnership. You stood beside me when the world was impossibly dark, and you became the shield I did not know I desperately needed. Today I vow to be your equal in all things. I vow to protect our joy with the exact same ferocity we used to fight for it. I promise to build a home with you that is rooted in absolute truth, where toxic shadows are never allowed to gather, and where our love remains an unshakable foundation. Gavin squeezed my hands tightly, a single tear escaping and tracking slowly down his cheek. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his gaze shifting seamlessly between me and Leo, who was standing just a few feet away, watching the exchange with wide, fascinated eyes. "Blair, you are the most courageous, brilliant woman I have ever known," Gavin said, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered emotion. "You walk straight through fire to protect the people you love, and you emerge stronger, brighter, and completely unbroken. I vow to spend every single day of my life proving that you never have to fight your battles alone again. I promise to be your refuge, your loudest advocate, and your unwavering partner in every adventure. But these vows are not just for you. Gavin turned his body entirely, dropping down onto one knee so he was exactly at eye level with Leo. He reached out, resting his large, warm hand gently over my son's heart. Leo stepped closer, entirely captivated by the solemnity and the immense love radiating from the moment. Leo Gavin continued, his voice soft, but carrying perfectly through the silent venue. I vow to be the father you deserve. I promise to fiercely protect you, to guide you, and to celebrate every single thing that makes you incredible. I promise that in this family, there are no secrets. You will always be heard, you will always be safe, and you will always know exactly how much you are loved. We are officially breaking the old generational curses today, buddy. From this second forward, we write our own rules, and we protect our own. Leo's eyes welled with happy tears, and unable to contain himself a second longer, he threw his arms around Gavin's neck, dropping the velvet ring pillow right onto the floor. A ripple of warm, joyful laughter echoed through the glass house, completely breaking the solemn tension. I knelt down right beside them, wrapping my arms around my husband and my son, sealing the three of us together in an embrace that felt like the absolute definition of home. We picked up the dropped rings, laughing through our tears as we slipped the gold bands onto each other's fingers. When the officiant finally pronounced us husband and wife, the applause that erupted around us was absolutely deafening, a roaring, triumphant testament to the brand new legacy we had just officially begun. The deafening applause inside the glass house seamlessly dissolved into the vibrant, thumping bass of the evening reception. We moved the celebration from the Botanical Conservatory out onto the sprawling, manicured lawns of the coastal estate, underneath a sprawling canopy of ancient stars and glowing strings of cafe lights. The atmosphere was intoxicating, a stark, brilliant contrast to the stiff, heavily curated galas Catherine had forced me to attend throughout my youth. There were no silent judgments exchanged over crystal champagne flutes, no hushed gossip regarding social status, and no frantic attempts to secure political leverage. Instead, the air was thick with the rich scent of catered coastal cuisine and the uninhibited echoing sound of genuine raucous laughter. Waiters navigated the crowd with trays of signature cocktails, while a live band kept the energy surging with a set list we had curated entirely for joy, not for prestige. I stood near the edge of the polished mahogany dance floor, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, simply soaking in the masterpiece of the life we had forged. My gaze drifted toward the center of the crowd, completely captivated by the sight unfolding before me. Leo was in the absolute center of a massive, joyful circle, his custom suit jacket long discarded, and his tiny bow tie hanging loose around his unbuttoned collar. He was laughing uncontrollably, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated happiness, as Gavin's sisters took turns spinning him around to the upbeat tempo. Sarah was teaching him some ridiculous, exaggerated dance move, while Elena and Chloe cheered them on, clapping loudly to the rhythm. Gavin's parents were watching from a nearby high-top table, their expressions radiating profound, unmistakable adoration for the young boy they had claimed as their own grandson without a single second of hesitation. Seeing Leo enveloped in that kind of effortless, unconditional warmth struck a deep, resonant chord within my chest. He was never going to know the agonizing, suffocating pressure of trying to earn his place at a family dinner table. He would never be subjected to the cruel, calculating comparisons or the silent, toxic demands for absolute perfection that had defined my own upbringing. He was safe. He was celebrated exactly as he was, an innocent child entirely free from the burden of adult secrets. Gavin materialized beside me, slipping his strong arm around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. He rested his chin gently on the top of my head, watching our son command the dance floor with a soft, affectionate chuckle. We stood there together, anchored in the perfect stillness of the moment, surrounded by a chosen family that had stepped into the terrifying void and filled it with brilliant, unshakable light. As the evening deepened and the ocean breeze rolled in over the cliffs, I found myself quietly reflecting on the brutal, twisting journey that had brought me to this exact coordinate in time. For 29 years, I had been force-fed the relentless, paralyzing lie that blood was an unbreakable covenant, a sacred debt that demanded absolute compliance and silent suffering. I had been systematically taught that family was a fixed ledger where you owed your unwavering loyalty, regardless of the profound emotional bankruptcy it caused you. But standing here enveloped in the protective embrace of a man who fought for me, and watching the radiant joy of a child I had sacrificed my own reputation to save, I finally understood the absolute truth. Blood does not forge a family. Biology is nothing more than a random genetic coincidence. True family is constructed entirely from the heavy, undeniable metals of loyalty, unshakable truth, and fierce, uncompromising protection. It is built by the people who show up when your world goes entirely dark, the ones who stand beside you in the brutal trenches and flatly refuse to let you fall. I had spent my entire professional career managing corporate assets, balancing heavily leveraged books, and assessing the distinct value of intricate financial investments. But the most vital life-saving audit I ever performed was the ruthless, absolute accounting of my own existence. I had examined the balance sheet of my history and clearly identified the gaping, hemorrhaging deficits. I had forcefully and unapologetically liquidated the toxic liabilities, cutting Donovan, Catherine, and Vanessa out of my life with clinical surgical precision. I had severed the corrupted supply lines that drained my sanity and demanded my silent submission. I executed a hostile takeover of my own destiny. In their place, I took every single remaining fraction of my energy, my hard-won resilience, and my fierce capacity for love, and I invested it entirely into the assets that actually mattered. I invested in Gavin's unwavering partnership. I invested in Leo's brilliant, beautiful future. I invested in my own unshakable peace. And the return on that investment was standing right in front of me, bathed in fairy lights and ringing with the sound of music. The live band seamlessly transitioned into a slower, soulful melody, the tempo dropping to a gentle, sweeping rhythm. Leo, completely exhausted from his energetic performance, abandoned the dance floor and ran directly toward us. He collided with my legs, wrapping his arms tightly around my waist, burying his face in the soft ivory silk of my gown. I dropped my glass onto a nearby table and scooped him up into my arms, his head resting heavily against my shoulder. Gavin stepped in closer, wrapping his arms securely around both of us, encasing us in a solid, impenetrable circle of warmth. I closed my eyes, breathing in the scent of the salt air and the clean, comforting fragrance of my husband and my son. The suffocating shadows of the past, the vile manipulations, the deliberate cruelties, and the chilling secrets were entirely eradicated, banished permanently to a world that could no longer touch us. I was Blair, a mother, a wife, and the sole architect of my own salvation. I held my family close, breathing in the absolute beautiful reality of my perfectly balanced books, entirely and irreversibly free. The most powerful lesson here is that true family is forged through choice, not biology. We often feel bound by the heavy chains of blood relations, tolerating toxic behavior out of a misplaced sense of obligation. However, taking control of our narrative requires a ruthless audit of our lives to identify what brings us peace. By bravely walking away from emotional deficits and investing in people who offer unwavering loyalty, we construct an unshakable foundation for happiness. Identify the toxic liabilities in your own life, reclaim your personal peace, and share your journey with us in the comment below.